Hi, I'm George Norrie, and welcome to our Coast to Coast AM YouTube channel. Have fun, tell your friends, and share us with everyone. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and Coast to Coast AM's mobile app. And always remember to log on to our website at coasttocoastam.com for daily articles, the best paranormal information, and all you need to know about your favorite guests. And now you can become a Coast Insider directly through the Coast mobile app. We welcome our international listeners and even offer a free 2-week trial. So don't delay. Become an insider today.
Our conversation with Bill Grabowski about his new book, Black Light, which, as I said at the beginning of the program, casts a pretty wide net in the paranormal spectrum, looking for connections between a whole bunch of really weird stuff. When we come back, we'll hear from him about his tracking down some of the witnesses to the weirdness in Point Pleasant and what they had to say up close and personal. Bill, let's go back and talk a little bit about the witnesses, the eyewitnesses in Point Pleasant. You tracked down a bunch of them, didn't you?
Yeah, I visited there 5 times, and most of the first 2 visits, I was not with my wife, Leanne, because I didn't know her yet, but I had a lot of interaction, and at the very first festival, for me anyway, the one where I met Keel, the one thing I noticed right away was that the town was divided about how they reacted to the festival. At this point, it was only the second event, and that was the first thing I asked people. So what do you think of this festival in your town? And it was either, I'm here to get some food and watch people, but regarding Mothman and all that, BS, I'm not interested in it. It's just awful. And there were a lot of religious type people who were saying, well, it was a demonic visitation, and the bridge collapsing proved that it was a punishment. And on the other hand, you had the people who were absolutely overjoyed to have this festival there and have some positive attention to the town. And then I started to ask my individually geared questions. I started off with people who were a lot older looking, because obviously it was at this time it was 2003. With just wondering, I'm here in town, and I wondered if you've seen anything during the 2-year span of the phenomenon. And I would say I probably spoke to it was at least 50 people. Out of those 50, probably 40 at least said they had seen UFOs out mostly near the TNT area, which was 7 miles north of town, but also in town. And I was also surprised to hear there were a lot of daylight sightings, which are harder to figure out. And most of those were described as your 60s model silver saucer-shaped craft. There were a few differences, though. One was described as a rectangular, very long object that went over someone's backyard this was before the Mothman sighting. But yeah, the town was divided, and over the years, it seemed to become more accepting. And of course, by then it was attracting international visitors. There were news teams there from Japan, Germany, and now it's even bigger.
Do you have, though, you have experiences with witnesses who are still frightened to this day? Some of those
Yes.
who have seen the Mothman himself?
Yeah, some of them I spoke to. There weren't a whole lot of people who said they saw the Mothman entity, but the few who said they did, when someone's looking you in the face, it's hard to say, well, I think you're full of it, which in a few cases I was certain, but not in the others, where the way it was described was so, the descriptions were so flat. I was taking out my garbage, and I saw what I thought was an owl, and went into the woods and saw that it wasn't an owl. This was in the TNT area, because there are actual homes there. They're scattered, but it's so isolated But anyhow, most of the reports I heard of the actual sightings of the Mothman entity came from that area. And also there were a few who said they were driving to, there was a drive-in theater at the time across the river in Gallipolis, Ohio. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. Actually, the Silver Bridge used to lead right over there. And they had seen it on the way to a drive-in theater in flight.
So back to your idea, you had mentioned briefly that you thought one idea that you explore in the book is that maybe this is there were some incident reports, people saw something like a Mothman, other people saw a UFO. Someone in the government thought, aha, this is a great place to test out X, whether it's MK Ultra or pulling their chain or whatever the program would be called. What is your evidence for that? What leads you to the conclusion at least some of this was humans messing around?
Well, the first thing was just where Point Pleasant is located. It's within 200 miles of 3 Air Force bases: Wright-Patterson in Dayton, Lockbourne, which I think now is called Rickenbacker Airfield, outside of Columbus, Ohio, and then Oakdale, which is southwest of Pittsburgh. So that kind of rings a bell right there for aerial activity, especially Wright-Patterson being so close and known for, basically a hive of aerial experimentation, and also the Ohio River access. So they had easy air access, easy water access, and some of the early reports about men in black, for one thing, it wasn't mentioned in Keel's book, and I'm not sure he knew it or not, but he probably did. A lot of insurance offices were visited by men in black, and I found out that insurance offices often have blueprints for local companies. They had blueprints for the nuclear power plant that was going up in Point Pleasant. And it seems that, given this was the Cold War, some of these men in black may have been spies who wanted to look, or at least discredit people who reported them, and hence their bizarre behavior and their stuttering and acting like they're drunk. And the whole thing about where the men in black visited and what was available there, that was kind of a red flag to, just flat out human involvement. And of course, there are a lot of factories around Point Pleasant still today that produced exotic ceramics, metal, and other things used in the defense industry. So as far as the possibility for spying and espionage, it was wide open.
And if it's some outgrowth of MK Ultra, as you postulate, I mean, you don't prove it, but you postulate it, suggest it might be possible, what would be the purpose of that? Just to see if they could do it?
To see if it's possible to do, I guess I would call it mythological engineering, to see the effects on people. And again, I think it started with actual so-called paranormal phenomena with the Mothman sightings, and then could have been further exploited. And another thing is Point Pleasant, is also not very far from the intelligence infrastructure in Washington, D.C. and in Alexandria, Virginia. Not very far at all.
Nick Redfern, Nick Redfern's our guest in next hour. He had came up with a document, a Rand Corporation document, where they studied it on behalf of the Air Force. The idea of mythological creatures creating sort of a mythology just to see if they can get away with it, manipulate the public opinion, public mood. Yes,
yeah. Also sociological engineering, because there was talk of, it could have been in the same study, about trying to cast an image of Jesus on the clouds. They wanted to use this over Cuba to basically freak out people, because obviously a lot of Catholics in Cuba rather. That was mentioned. I think the actual instrument is called a Mitralux, which casts an immensely powerful beam and basically any image you want, which it sounds almost laughable, but you never know. If people are terrified, the perceptions are heightened and emotions take over, and they can color things. They can project things onto it, which may have very well have happened in some of the entity sightings of Mothman and Thunderbirds.
But as you say, that does not explain all of it. It certainly didn't explain it for Keel, who,
No.
A lot of people would have classified him as a ufologist at points in his career. I think he referred to himself as a demonologist. I think you mentioned that in the book. I
Yes,
mean,
he did.
is that a literal sort of a way? Is that his explanation for paranormal in general? Is that it's demonic?
Well, like a lot of the things Keel said, I think there was a lot more metaphor involved and not so much literalism. But in his worst moments, when he was besieged with these phone calls, and a lot of which were threatening, he said there is definitely a demonic element in how the phenomena affects you. Once you step into the link, you're part of it, and there can be a reflexive effect where things come back on you. For instance, he would ask a so-called entity a question, a phone voice, and a lot of the times he was convinced he was receiving these phone calls from someone in like a post-hypnotic state, because often they would say, "Hey, so-and-so is standing here right next to me," like in the movie where Gordon Smallwood's character, played by Will Patton, says, "I have injured colds right here with me on the phone."
Right.
And they would make claims, and then Keel thought that he was going to lose his mind because some of the things they said to him came true, or they just knew details that would be very difficult to know unless you were in someone's mind. And also, there were incidents in Point Pleasant and nearby with people hearing voices, and there were tests of called microwave hearing even in the late 50s about how to broadcast a voice into someone's head, either for military purposes to give direction or to drive people mad. So there is some outside documentation on these things.
What appealed to me about Keel's central sort of message is that he looked at the UFO mystery and saw beyond just nuts and bolt saucers. With the prevalent view then and maybe even now, is it extraterrestrials? These are beings from other planets visiting us in craft, and he saw it as something else. That maybe this goes a lot beyond just something as simple as that, which Jacques Vallée has written extensively about it, and tying into a lot of other kind of mysteries, other kinds of creatures, that it seems to be some sort of a grand design, sort of almost like a play or theater, to mess with us, either to educate us or to bring us along or just to really pull our chain. In your book, you say, there's a section where you go, "In my estimation, Keel summed up what all others have missed. UFOs, paranormal phenomena, are real, they exist, and are a normal aspect of our environment. What they might actually be, we do not and probably cannot know." Is that sum it up for you?
Yes. Yeah. Of course, the part about we may never know or we can't know, that is my personal opinion, because look how long it's been studied, and basically we come up with theories. Very little can be proven, but especially Jacques Vallée. I believe he actually states in those words, this is stage management here.
It's a control system.
Theater.
Yeah, it's a control system.
Fantastic theater, but it's frightening theater. And I believe he and Keel pretty much arrived. They pretty much both trashed the extraterrestrial hypothesis in the mid '60s when after extensive research, they came to these conclusions. These cannot be. Although Vallée says the craft are physical, but they're not real, which is hard to wrap your brain around. Because how can someone be physical? How can something be physical but not be real? And he has more of a being French, there's more of a surrealistic angle to Vallée's theories than to Keel. But Keel obviously I think they were. I'm not going to say they were pals, but they were definitely on the same page regarding the, I guess you would call it the psychosocial theory.
You know, I see these cases. Some of the cases were coming up on an anniversary of the Hopkinsville UFO case where these aliens
Yes.
showed up, and you know, it's like a shooting gallery. It is so preposterous on its face. Some of the stuff that happened at the Utah Ranch, so ridiculous as to you don't even want to mention it. And then, you know, Point Pleasant and some of the experiences there, it is so preposterous and over the top that it's almost designed to look like no one could ever possibly believe this, to stretch the limits of our credulity. Obviously, you've thought about that.
Yes. Yeah, that was when I first read about Men in Black, for instance. Over and over, I'm seeing, okay, they have trouble breathing. They make absurd statements. You know, what time is it? What is your time? And you know, would intelligent creatures do this? And then reading Vallée, where he says, well, here, maybe there is a reason for this absurd theater, or whatever you want to call it. It's meant to cause cognitive dissonance. It's meant to affect you emotionally with a powerful series of images that are going to sink into you, and you won't be able to forget them, in order to program consciousness, raise, you know, heighten evolution. That was part of Vallée's series, the control system hypothesis, and I think Keel mostly agreed with that, but not so much. Keel's take on it was far darker than Vallée. Keel was more about, I don't think they care about us at all. They're just tampering because they can. It's not meant for any sort of transformative effect. Where Vallée thought that, you know, possibly this external, whatever it is, intelligence is actually trying to have an effect on us. But the way we see it is, you know, it's a live wire. If you touch a live wire, you're going to get electrocuted. And the phenomenon can present itself that way and may not even be hostile. It's something beyond we have no model for it, how to interact with it. And so when we do, it comes out as either terrifying or, on the other hand, has a beneficial effect on people's lives. They come away from it with new talents, like author Andy Colvin mentioned, who lived near the Point Pleasant area.
Yeah, I've had him on the program. He was a good guest, yeah.
Probably numerous times, I think. And he mentioned acquiring artistic skills after some unusual experiences.
Well, it just seems like in the big picture, you know, the positive me wants to say it's a learning curve of some sort. They're trying to tell us something. We're not quite smart enough to figure it out, but maybe we just need a little more info. The negative part of me says this is a diversion. This is a circus to keep us busy and occupied. It's opium for the masses, keeping us trying to figure out what the twinkly lights in the sky are, while they, whoever they are, carry out whatever it is their agenda might be.
Yeah, I would have to say I'm on that page as well, because I have the practical side, and then I have the fantastical side that writes horror fiction, and those two feed each other. And then I try and back away from both and say, well, how do I feel about this as a human being? I've been asked a few times, well, yeah, of course you must be an atheist. Well, no, I'm not an atheist. Because that is like the ultimate cop-out to me. That's like just committing spiritual suicide. We can't explain ourselves, so therefore you can't rule out an intelligence other than us. And I think we project our despair onto it, our hope onto it, and therefore it manifests the way that it does now. And now with we have dominating influence of the internet, right? And our collective unconscious or subconscious. It's projecting new fears. We have
it's the cosmic Rorschach test or something.
What a way to put it. That is exactly it.
You mentioned about the Will Patton character in the movie, the Mothman Prophecies, and I remember in the movie he committed suicide. Was there any suicide? Did any of the witnesses get so troubled that they took their own lives?
The only accounts I know of are those mentioned by Keel in Mothman Prophecies. And I think he also mentions it in Disneyland of the gods, and he doesn't name names, of course, but he said that there were suicides, and then of course Mary Heyer, the Point Pleasant Register reporter, died sort of suspiciously in 1970, and she'd either just made a phone call or just received one, and she was found dead in her home. And she was not that old. I think she was 54 or 55.
I mentioned before that that Keel had sometimes referred to himself as a demonologist.
Yes.
And does he mean that in a literal sense of there are demons that intervene in our lives, or did he mean it in a more generic sense that whatever this thing is, this intelligence that intervenes in our lives, that it is evil?
I think he meant that whatever these entities are, that they behave, their effect on us can be demonic, as in causing terror and seemingly outright hostility, negative influence. I don't think he meant as in devils and Beelzebub in the literal way, but I think he meant it as possibly was meant even in the Bible, as these things are negative, and people call them certain things at certain times in our culture.
And I promise this will be the last thing I ask, and then a lot of people are on the phones waiting to talk to you. But you mentioned in the book, which I haven't mentioned it enough, but it's called Black Light. You should really check it out, folks. Bill Grabowski really lays it out there. But you mentioned that the government, you speculate on the government, and I'm sort of in the same spot as you, that there is not going to be any big revelation because chances are pretty good they don't know a whole lot more than the rest of us.
That is precisely what I think, that it's been going on far too long of pointing the finger at the government, because for one thing it invests them with this godlike power that, given how bureaucracies function, it cannot structurally work that way. And plus, if you think of the money that would be required for certain effects that, when you look back on them, what did they accomplish? They scared a lot of people. Yeah, they sure did. And they probably learned a lot of things. But as far as, are they responsible for all of this? No. The problem now is we have drone technology, which is really, really confusing the issue of UFOs.
Yeah.
And you've probably seen as many videos as I have that look profoundly strange until you look at them again, and then here's some further reports that that was actually a new kind of drone that has cameras on it that are being used by people making films, and if you see it at night, it looks very strange. I
think because of drone technology, because of CGI, special effects technology available to anyone with a laptop, that UFO videos, for all intents and purposes, the evidential value of them are way down. Yeah, that's going even deeper and deeper into the hole. It's like every time I see one, new evidence, I'm like, oh, brother, here we go. Just like, these images from Mars. But, yeah, as far as the UFO footage you're seeing on YouTube and elsewhere, some of which looks very, very convincing, probably 99% of it is somebody having a good time, and there are even apps for your phone. Yeah, the government doesn't have to make it up anymore. The people online are happy to do it and confuse it and muddy the waters all themselves. Yeah, it raises interesting possibilities that the people who are in this kind of business are a lot better at it than we are at ours, and they can see a lot further down the road and what the ultimate goal might be, and preparing us for whatever might still be to come. And also, no oversight on the budget for depending on what the project might be. Yeah, I'm watching this debate about, Rand Paul is having monopolizing time on the floor of the Senate. Wants to draw attention to the extension of the Patriot Act and the NSA spying on all of us, and he's asking, where is the outrage? And I'm asking the same question: where is the outrage about authorizing them to spy on everyone? Why aren't we up in arms about that? How can we possibly think that it's that this is a good thing? And it occurs to me that even if the Senate did not approve it, the Congress did not vote to approve it, they could do it anyway, and there's not much we could do to stop them.
Yeah, this has been proven. I mean, there's an excellent book by James Bamford. It's about the NSA. It's called The Shadow Factory, where he goes into excruciating detail about how to get around these laws. And in a lot of cases, they just say, "Well, we need to know these things. We're going to do them anyway." And people, the public has been very sheepish about accepting this in the guise of national security. Like, everything is dangerous now, and we'll protect you, but we need this information, and we need to spy on you all the time.
Well, I guess as an example of what Archer was sort of getting at in that last call is they've been seeding this kind of imagery for a long time. Be afraid. Be very, very afraid. Give us the authority to do whatever we want. Thank you very much. And then once you give up those rights, there's no going back. You think any of those experiences are military, intelligence, MK Ultra type stuff that people are led to believe that they've been? Yeah. I mean, have you got an example of one that what you would say definitely falls in that category?
I put one in the book that was, I don't want to waste time flipping through it here, but anyhow, it was an individual who said that he was out camping and was hit by a strange light and came to in a blue van that he was positive was a Navy van, not navy blue as in naval, and was taken to just a normal facility somewhere, and then was later visited a psychiatrist who unfortunately used hypnotic regression, which is not a reliable tool because it causes confabulation, and had a full-blown memory of your typical abduction and examination and the trauma that causes.
Quickly before we go, so in essence, there could be the government messing with us, the government putting a lot of this stuff in our heads, jacking us around, pulling our chain, but that doesn't account for all of it. There really is something out there.
No, it does not account for all of it. It can't possibly. And that's the aspect of the high strangeness, where there's some things we may never figure out, or we may in decades from now, but there is that small percentage that just cannot be explained through.
All right, Bill Grabowski, thanks for coming on the show, and we'll have you back. The book is called Black Light. It's an excellent read, folks. Check it out. Thanks, Bill.
Broadcasting from the confines of an abandoned radio station in the secluded apartment building of high strangeness from the foothills of the Colorado Rockies. It's time for full disclosure of the topics they told us were off limits. I'm Connie Willis. This is Coast to Coast AM. Tonight, two men I call friends. Time to turn off the lights. Go over there now. Go ahead, turn them off. Join me for another interesting evening of conversation, much needed education, and the chance that we might get a little closer to the truth of what lurks amongst us and what is beyond. Here's a friend. Our first guest is a friend of mine as well. And I haven't talked to him in a long time, lives in Egypt. But it's funny because I end up talking about him all the time because people will, as I interview them or just have a conversation or whatever the deal is, the case is when it comes to UFOs or even experiments into the unknown when it comes to ghost and mediumship as well and afterlife. And my friend's name comes up often because people will refer to his films or they'll say they're not quite sure how to think, and I will suggest his films because they'll take you right over that hump. If you're on the fence, they take you right over the hump. And I remember the first time I had met him, who I'm about to bring up, and I remember saying to him that, hey, that film you made, that is the film that if people are on the fence, that's what makes you go to the side of belief. And it's just a huge film. That one was out of the blue. The UFO film that you guys all know, groundbreaking documentary of the UFO subject and widely considered one of the best ever made. Absolutely. Absolutely. So Tim Coleman is who I'm talking about. He's a multi-award-winning documentary filmmaker, photographer, great work, journalist as well. Boy, let me tell you, he'll come back on you with some facts too. And a BBC broadcaster, excuse me. And you'll know that as soon as you hear his voice. He's best known for the Out of the Blue. He also initiated and developed Surviving Death. That's a 6-part series documentary on the evidence of life after death, and it is the the second most popular program on Netflix in America. So that's huge. A lot of you guys have seen that and talked about that. He produced and directed one that everybody seems to be talking about recently, and it's been a while that he put it together, but the afterlife investigations, the skull experiments that you guys go, oh, yeah, the skull experiment. Amazing film. Amazing film. So that's also an award-winning documentary, and just unbelievable, unusual, compelling evidence ever for life after death. I know that Bigelow was doing, looking, right? He was working with Coast on that, or at least was a big part of being with Coast on that. And I just kept thinking about Tim's work. He also co-produced several other ones. We can talk about all those. I can go on and on. We did the Crop Circle Quest for the Truth with Gazetke, and he's got many others. But let's bring him on because it is so nice to be able to do that for the first time ever. I get to bring him on. Tim Coleman. Hey, Tim, welcome to Coast with me this time. Yay! How are you?
Hey, Connie. It's so lovely to talk to you and hear your lovely voice.
I'm so happy. For years it's always been like, hey, I'm going to interview you one day. And here we go. So it's quite a pleasure. And it's just great to hear your voice again. We got connected. It's been a couple of years. We didn't really get to talk, but here we are. And it's nice. Yeah, it's really nice. What have you been up to, Mr. Egypt boy?
Yeah, well, I kind of took a sort of, as the Netflix thing got off the ground and that got out in last January. And as you say, it was very successful. But I kind of took a back seat from directing due to kind of some health problems. So I sort of went back to my first passion, which is photography, because I was, that's how I earned a living when I started out. And so I've been in Egypt. I've been coming to Egypt since I was 22 years old, and I'm 63 now. So a long time, I have a kind of deep spiritual, psychological connection with the country. So that was first to do with ancient Egypt, and then I got involved with the whole Sphinx thing, the redating the Sphinx with John West. So we were pals.
Wow. That's interesting.
Yeah, I was kind of the first journalist to write about that in England. And so I've just, been exploring Egypt for a long time, and then I decided that, I also made a film about the Sufi festivals out here, which are pretty amazing. That was a long time ago. That was for Channel 4 TV, and then that fell through, so I shot it myself. And then, I took a lot of photographs over the years. And then the last couple of years, I decided to really focus in on the photography and do a book called The Soul of Egypt, which is trying to capture the essence of this country the tourists never really see. You zip by on a tour bus and you'll see the pyramids and stuff, and you go down to Luxor, but you won't see 90% of the really interesting stuff, which is really how the sort of hidden side of Egypt. So that's what I've been doing for the last few years.
Tim, your pictures are unbelievable. They are just so gorgeous. They really are.
Thank you.
You've always liked. Yeah. Oh, you're welcome. You've always liked to do shots of people.
Yes, I'm basically a portrait photographer. I'm more a kind of reportage street photographer. I like catching people unawares and sort of, so you can sort of get a real sense of reality about that. Photography has moved more into sort of like people posing and staring vacuously into the camera.
Yes,
sort of more modern. I like you might as well be taking a kind of passport photo, but that's kind of not my scene. So I do mainly travel and reportage. I used to work when I was working as a journalist. I would do all my own photographs as well. So I have a background in sort of magazine photography as well. So
amazing work. Yeah. And it's funny because I'll be out on my show or something like that myself, and I don't ever have pictures of myself doing it, and I need it for the website. So I'll ask people, can you take a picture of me when you see me doing some work or something like that? And they'll go, oh yeah. And if they do remember, they'll stand there and they'll go, look up, and they want me to smile. I'm like, no, get me working, please. Don't, I don't want to smile.
Yeah, no,
right?
No posing.
That's right.
Yeah.
No posing. Just because this is in my mind right now, the old photographs of people when they always just look straight, and, the older photographs, I don't know what year or decade they would be, but it was a long time ago when people got them. Then they would never smile, and they would just kind of look like,
No.
why was that?
Well, that was the Victorian age when the birth photography began about 1830s, and it developed from there on. But the film was very, very, very poor. So in terms of its reaction to light, so what you have to do is you go into a studio, and the shutter exposure would be like 30 seconds, maybe a minute, right? Which means it's going to be blurry if you move. So they used to put these, family or something like that, and they'd have a metal clamp, and they'd clamp your head into it, so you couldn't move, right? You were just like stuck in there, and that way the picture would be sharp. So that's why they kind of have these rather peculiar expressions, because
they look like they were mad. Yeah, they look like they were mad at the world. Okay, now it makes sense. Okay, I appreciate that.
Probably because it was painful.
There is a screw in the back of my head here. It will not move. Hey, why have you chosen Egypt? Why do you live in Egypt? What's that about? Now, I've always wanted to see the pyramids, but why Egypt for you?
Okay, so I live 50-50. I live in the winter. I come out here because the English winters are just too horrible for me. So I live part of the time in London. I have a house in London, but I can't do cold anymore, right? I mean, that's why I lived in California for a long time, because of the English weather and the English class system, which I hate. But anyway, so I went to Egypt initially to sort of, because I had a fascination with the ancient Egyptian culture. And I do feel going a bit woo-woo that I kind of had some sort of past lives here or something like that. I'm sure, because it wasn't rational. I didn't study Egyptology. That wasn't in my education. But once I sort of connected with Egypt, there was this powerful draw to the culture, the ancient culture. And then once I'd started, coming here to exploring ancient Egypt, I sort of realized the culture here is extremely complex, extremely interesting, and Egyptian people are just very, very wonderful people. They're heart-based people, so there's kind of the opposite of the English, a bit shut down emotionally. These guys are just like they're so lovely, they're so generous, they're so kind. If you're lost, they won't give you directions. They'll walk you to your destination, that kind of thing. And, I just love that kind of interaction with people. But, on a sort of more professional level, it was also, I was doing, I discovered that I could do sort of articles out here and programs. So my first BBC radio jobs was going out to Egypt, and that was one on the Great Pyramid. And sort of the beginning of sort of New Age tourism. And so people were coming out here to meditate in the temples and the tombs and what have you, or the pyramid specifically. So I made a program about that, people who kind of rent the King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid in order to do rituals and stuff like that. So I did a program on that, and then I managed to, as part of that, I sort of got to know the guy who had the keys to the Great Pyramid.
Yeah, I want to hear this one.
And I got so the Egyptian government was saying, okay, you can rent the space, but it's going to cost you $10,000 or whatever, something I can't remember. I said, okay,
what?
Great. So I went to sort of like my friend who had called Champion, and he used to run up and down the side of the Great Pyramid in front of the kings and queens and the visiting, aristocracy back in the day, yeah. And he was an old man with one eye, and he's an amazing guy. And I got friends with him, and he said, look, if you want to spend the night in the Great Pyramid, I can arrange that for you. So I said, yeah, sure. So, at 6 o'clock, the tourists go, and they shut it down. He opens the door. I go in with my sleeping bag, my book, and my flashlight.
All by yourself?
They lock me in, all by myself.
Oh.
And then they lock you in. They lock you in, right? So if anything happens, you can't get out, right? And then there's inside the King's Chamber, there's a camera and a little AC thing and a light, and they cut the power, so you're in total darkness.
How dark was it?
Well, there's no light. So this is what was really interesting, because there's absolutely no light coming into the King's Chamber. It's totally pitch black, right? So it's impossible to have any light in there at all, right? I started meditating, and after about an hour or two, I opened my eyes, and I suddenly realized I could see my hands. And I thought, that's impossible, because I know there's no source of light.
Wow.
So I thought, oh my God, this is a bit scary. And the light, which was this kind of greenish phosphorescent light, it wasn't normal light, white light, started to increase in luminosity. So I thought, oh my God, any minute now, Tutankhamun is going to manifest in front of me. I'm going to be chopped liver. So basically, it just kind of rose to a peak, and then it just disappeared. So it's just one of those many anomalies that people report when they go into the King's Chamber or the pyramid, or hold around the whole idea that the pyramid is some energy resonator was actually physically demonstrated to me on that occasion.
That is unbelievable. So, wow, did you feel any different as well, or just notice the luminosity?
No, I didn't feel anything. I was really scared, to tell you the truth. So I thought,
Yeah.
they'll just find me mummified in the morning, right? But no, it was just a sort of beautiful experience, and sort of like, oh wow, because there had been all these stories about the Great Pyramid, and there was this anecdotal one about Napoleon when he invaded Egypt. One of the first things he did was to spend the night in the Great Pyramid. Now, I'm not 100% sure this is true. Excuse me. But he spent the night in the Great Pyramid, and then he came out in the morning, and his generals came up to him, and he looked ashen. He was white with fear. And they came up to him, and they said, oh, sir, what's happened? Is it, and he said, that's it. I'm not, don't, that's it. I don't talk about it, right? So he just dismissed it. And then the story was that when he'd finally lost against the British and they put him on Elba for exile, he was on his deathbed, his aide asked him, please tell us what happened to you that night. And he said, even if I told you, you would never believe me. And he went to his grave, never revealing the secret of what happened.
You have any ideas?
Maybe the dude's just going to lose against the British. I don't know.
Oh, maybe.
I have no idea. But something scared him. Something really scared him.
Yeah.
But I don't know. That's anecdotal, so who knows?
Tim, please jump in when you want to, because Tim's with me here. So I was actually working at one point with Mark Victor, who what you guys would know with Poltergeist. He worked with the blockbuster Poltergeist. He was an author he was one of the writers on the first one. And then I believe, and Tim, correct me, I believe he was producers on the other ones. Anyway, he was putting together a internet documentary platform, and I had connected with him, and I was out looking for documentaries that were paranormal in some way to be able to put on his platform. And that's how I actually met you, Tim. And it was all about getting out of the blue. And so do you remember that? Do you actually remember that?
No. Yeah, it was a long time ago. Yeah. But...
how did you think we met? Do you remember?
I can't really remember.
You saw a hot chick walking by one day, and you stopped me. That's what it was.
Yeah, I mean, it must have been through Mark Victor. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's what it was. Yeah, that's exactly what it was.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I guess because he certainly had the afterlife investigations up there, and I've just put it back up there on his channel.
Yeah.
But you can always see that for free anyway on my website, and I've got all my films up there, and you can watch them all for free up there anyway.
I forgot you had that memory thing. I didn't want to expose that. I'm sorry. I should not have said any of that.
Yeah,
because I got that afterlife over there to him too, Bucko. Just FYI. Any of those, all those earnings you got paying for that home in London? Yeah, right. Maybe some food for you, right? Hey, yeah, let's talk about that now. Out of the Blue, that's the one film to me. That's the way I always express it, is Out of the Blue is the film that if you're on the fence about UFOs being real or not, this is the one that takes you over.
Yeah, that's exactly why we made it. And that was with James Fox and Boris Zubov. We sort of, we shared the directing credit on that because it was kind of a 3-man team, and we put it together for something like $20,000, and which I think my mum gave me. And
nice.
We made that one. Because basically, I'd been writing about the UFO subject. I've been into the UFO subject like for forever. Even when I was like 10 years old, I went to a kind of very strict preparatory school in London. That's before they send you off to a private school. And there was like they'd teach you Latin and stuff like that back in those days in England. And I said, I'm not going to learn Latin. I refused to do that. I got all stroppy about it. So they said, go and see the art teacher and do a project with her. And she said, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to write an essay about the UFO subject. That was at 10 years old. So something was going on there. I had a curiosity that began very early. So that eventually manifested because I tried to get a documentary off the ground in England for ages. So this is way back in the 90s, right? And I couldn't get anywhere. So that's really why I moved to the States, because I thought, well, okay, I'm going to have my mother's American. I got a passport. I can live out there. I'm going to go out there and I'm going to try and make this film. And I looked at all the UFO documentaries around, and they were all pretty rubbish. And then I saw James Fox's UFO 50 Years of Denial, which was his first. And I got hold of James and I said, hey, dude, this is great. Let's work together. And within 3 years, we had made Out of the Blue, which was the highest rated show in its strand on the Sci-Fi Channel. It was a big success.
Absolutely.
And to this day, that's the film I'm pretty much the most proudest of, because we pulled it off on a shoestring. Does that make sense in America? When you haven't got any money.
No, you nailed it.
On a low budget.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was very successful, and it achieved, as you say, it's like, give this film to a skeptic, because it's got, even Michael Shermer, skeptic, the famous skeptic, gave us a very positive review. He didn't slam it because the evidence was rock solid. It was very well done journalistically.
Yeah, you did a great job.
Thank you. Yeah,
you did.
I think.
And James too.
It's been superseded. I mean, James went on to do some other films on that subject. I sort of bifurcated and went in another direction to do the stuff on life after death, and then James carried on just making more stuff on UFOs. And as you know, his latest one, Phenomenon, is, in my view, the best documentary about UFOs that's ever been made. So a shout out for James. Good to you, man. James, we're best of friends, and for one reason or other, I didn't have any children. That kind of opportunity slipped me by, and I told James, don't make the same mistake I have. Have kids. He met this wonderful woman, and I just said, look, have a child. It'll be the best thing in your life, and he did, and it was. And so I'm so glad about that.
Yeah, it was wonderful to see that. I haven't talked to him in a long, long, long time, but I remember seeing that happening, and I just thought that was great. That was great. And so I kind of see the film that you did, I Know What I Saw, and James was with that, right? And I thought that was kind of like number 2 of Out of the Blue. Would you agree with that?
That's right. It was.
To me, that feels
that was a follow-up to Out of the Blue, and it had some of the sort of some of the footage that we shot for Out of the Blue in it. So I Know What I Saw has some of the footage about Out of the Blue in it, but it's a completely different film. So I got a credit on that film. But I didn't direct it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Crop Circles. I knew William Gazecki. What did you do with Crop Circles and Quest for Truth?
Well, originally he brought me in as a cinematographer, and so I shot some of it for him. He'd sort of got this place, a beautiful place in the countryside. He wanted me to sort of do that because I'm British and I kind of knew that scene a little bit. Although I must admit, I was kind of a newbie into the crop circle scene.
Yeah.
And I thought the UFO, community was, had its fair share of high strangeness and strange people in it. Until I went to the crop circle scene, because there was, that was just unbelievable. I mean, there's so many interesting people there. I loved it because it sort of brought all these sort of fascinating people together. You know, whether you're a believer or a non-believer, it just sort of stimulated and produced this fascinating debate about what was going on and how we get to the bottom of it. So that was fun working on that film. And, William was an amazing director.
Yeah, and it got pretty creepy. It got pretty strange. It wasn't just crop circles. It was what happens within them. It was also all sorts of different, like, psychic kind of weird, crazy things. I mean, it gets deep in the crop circle world. It gets deeper than I think most people think until they go into it and go, holy cow, I didn't realize all of that stuff was happening.
Yeah, I mean, I just think most people, there was that in the 90s, late 90s, it was such an exciting period for me and paranormal, because the UFO thing was taking off. You had the X-Files. Suddenly, in Britain anyway, the community sort of opened up to the paranormal, and there was a whole bunch of paranormal magazines and UFO magazines which I was writing for that came out, like the X Factor and things like that. So that's how I kind of really got into it, by writing articles about it, and then sort of edged into the film world on it. So it was really exciting, and the crop circle thing was just on fire in the late 90s.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of settled down now because people have come to whatever conclusions they've come to about it. But I don't think we still know what's going on there, frankly.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's interesting because I had talked to someone at one point that I really respected in life and mentioned something about the crop circles. And they said, oh, no, they've debunked that a long time ago with those guys with the board and the ropes. And I looked at him and I thought, I have lost all respect for you now. Because people believe that. Well, they believe that article. Oh.
Well, okay, so here's the thing. When I was doing the BBC radio program, they asked me to do one about this crop circle making competition. This was back in the 90s, and it was set up by the Guardian newspaper, which is a big national newspaper. And it sort of threw the gauntlet down and to the hoaxers, right? Because this is the big problem, because people sort of hoaxing them, so it contaminated the real phenomenon. So they said, okay, you've got 6 hours to make a rather complicated crop circle, and we're going to judge you by, how well you do it and the noise and the mess you make and all that. And in the morning, there were some amazingly pristine circles that had been handmade, and there were some pretty bad ones when people drank too much cider and they couldn't get it right. So it was interesting to see how well it could be done by humans.
Yeah.
Right. So one had to be really careful about this, because it can be done that way.
Yes.
It can be done very well. But at the same time, there are all these characteristics in circle genuine phenomenon, crop circles, that just can't be faked. The exploded node, the bent node, the strange ground traces, the sort of strange things that happen to electronic equipment, on and on and on. And I think, the most important thing, we spoke to some people who actually saw crop circles forming. Mm-hmm. So obviously that was sort of anecdotal because they didn't record it. But one of my favorites was from Nancy Talbot.
I was going to say Nancy, yeah.
Nancy. I mean, Nancy put in the hours there, man. So
yes.
She worked with this controversial medium, Robert Vandenbroek.
I've had him on Coast. Yeah, I had him on Coast. I had him on Coast a couple years ago.
Okay.
Yeah, and when we were talking, all of a sudden it went on. We were talking to him, I don't know how many minutes in, maybe 30 minutes, maybe it was even an hour and a half, and then cut off, boom, it was over. Just gone.
That's a pity. I mean, did he tell you the story about the crop circle forming out?
Yeah, go for it. Say it.
I was just like, because Nancy, I trust 1,000%, right? And, she was staying at Robert van den Broek's father's house in Holland. And, that evening there was all the sort of cattle went mad outside. And then, boom, these 3 shafts of light came sort of searing down into the back garden.
And she saw it.
She
saw it.
She saw it. And the whole house saw it. They all woke up.
Everybody saw
shouting.
it. Yeah.
Everybody saw it. And then, boom. The lights disappeared, and there was a steaming crop circle in the garden with her initial in it, T. And, she'd just been wanting to give up on the crop circle thing. She's, I'm too old for this kind of stuff. And, the next day, bam, there's a crop circle. There you go. That's just for Nancy. Now, that makes it, for me, like, I don't care what anybody says about crop circles being fake. There you go. Boom. Crop circle right in front of your eyes. So that's one real one. We know that's a real phenomenon.
Agreed. And that's when I learned about the nodes, every grass blade with the nodes where, because they were always, wherever these were made, it was a lot of high grass, right? And so the nodes look like what, if I remember correctly, they said it was like if it was in a microwave and it would explode. It was like microwave popcorn, right? Like, and all the nodes were
exactly
exploding.
right. Exactly right. Exactly right.
Nobody can fake that. Yeah.
Yeah, you can't. You can't. And then there were the insects that were stuck to the stems and the stalks and what have you, as if they'd been fused to the plant by some strange, energy. So, there's a bunch of stuff. I mean, I know that, doing the film and writing about it, that there was a bunch of people who were out there hoaxing it, and I spoke to a lot of them, and their motivations, what they were doing. I didn't like what they were doing, but, they sort of saw it as a kind of a sort of sociological experiment and blah, 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 whatever.
Right. I agree.
It just muddies the waters. Thank you very much. When you've got something miraculous occurring, why do you need to go out and have to do something like that?
I love to hear that from you, Tim, because I feel that way in the Bigfoot world as well, the UFO world, the alien world, the abduction world. And that's what people seem to do. And there's story after story after story about that. And that's why people don't know to go left or right. And that's why I'm the advocate for the truth of all this. Hey, I got to tell you something. Okay. I think I may have told you this, but I'm not sure. But okay. So my dad passed away.
I know, I'm so sorry.
Sorry. It was like 12. It was in, February 7th, 2010. It was a Super Bowl Sunday. It was 9 a.m. when the church doors would open. That'd be perfect for my dad to have done it. That would have been my dad. But the day that he passed, later that day, when we were back at the house, my mom was sitting up on the end of her bed, and I was standing at the end of the bed. So it was a sleigh bed. So the part of that sleigh part was in between us, right? And my mom threw a Starlight peppermint at me, and a little wrapped up individually one. And I said, Mom, what'd you do that for? She was like 2 feet away from me. I was like, what'd you do that for? She goes, what are you talking about? I said, you just threw that peppermint at me. And she said, no, I didn't. I said, Mom, come on. I mean, we were the only two in the room. She goes, no, I didn't. I was like, Mom, you threw that at me, right? I mean, come on. What's she even lying to me about it? And then we stopped and looked at each other, and I thought, actually, there's no way she could have thrown that without me seeing her entire arm and hand throwing it. And we both stopped and went, Dad, because that was Dad's little signature little candy that he always had all the time, right? And it just came out of thin air. Now that is what the afterlife, the skull experiments are like freaking all about. And you were right there producing and directing that. Tell me about that.
So what you're talking about, well, this is sort of after-death communications. That's one thing when, the dead give you a little sign that they're still around and they want to kind of, tell you that, and a number of different ways, and that's very fascinating. And there's one of the programs in the Netflix series is on that, Signs from the Dead, which is very wonderful, where this woman gets a cardinal, which she, her mother had, and the very rare bird suddenly appears lands on her shoulder. So you have these wonderful events where, the deceased is just saying, hey, there you go, I'm here. But in the skull experiment, which I'm not sure how familiar your viewers are with, I mean, I specifically... More
and more people talk about it. They really do.
Okay. Yeah, because this happened in the, like 93 to 98, something like that. 5-year experiment. And in my view, and in the view of the experts who studied it, from the SPR, Society for Psychical Research in England, which has been, one of the most prestigious organizations investigating paranormal phenomena for over 150 years, they investigated it and they could find no evidence of fraud, and they attended sessions, right? So in that, so I was doing it retrospectively. The skull experiment had finished by the time I started filming. So I was doing it kind of like interviewing all the participants and getting their video and footage and stuff like that. And it's unique. And in the words of Montague Keane, who was one of the investigators, he said, like, I've never seen anything like that ever. You know, there's just it provided more paranormal evidence for the existence of an afterlife than any experiment ever conducted ever in the history of the paranormal. Period.
Yeah. Are you the only one that was able to ever show it to anybody else? Are you the only outlet?
Yeah. We were the only ones to get in there. Then they allowed us to use the footage and make the documentary. People have been trying ever since, and they want to make a movie out of it, but you know, so they've signed some deal with some movie company, so they won't let documentary filmmakers make it until the movie's made, if it ever gets made. So we were like super lucky to get in there. I kind of did that off the back of out of the blue, so I had to get a bit of, you know, a reputation, so I could, you know, use that to leverage my way in there. You know,
and it worked, huh?
So
it worked.
And it worked. Yeah. So we were super lucky to get them, and they gave us full access to all their archive. You know, they had 5,000. Was it 500 or 5,000? Anyway, 500 hours, I think. 500 hours of recorded audio with spirits who were talking both through the mediums. So this was taking place in a 17th century little farmhouse in Skull, which is a tiny little village in England. Yeah. And they do it in the basement. And these guys are dedicated afterlife researchers, as Robin and Sandra Foy, and the Violets, who were the mediums, the two mediums, who were like just superstar mediums, just ordinary people who were just like having this amazing gift. And you know, they would try for like a year, you know, and sit for 2 hours every week, and nothing would happen for a year, right? So, you know, you've got to be really dedicated. And then suddenly the phenomenon started to happen more and more and more. And it just got so amazing that they could just sit down and regularly, the spirits would come through, talk through the larynxes of the mediums who would go into trance. And then you could have a two-way conversation with a spirit, which is pretty cool. And then later it developed so that the voices just come out of thin air.
Yeah.
Right?
And then
that's
stuff.
even more cool. Yeah, and there was like, okay, so to go back to your question about the apports, these objects, apports that appear, manifest out of nowhere, they had a whole bunch of stuff that would just like appear. And
just
one of the most
out of the sky or out of the
was,
air.
Sorry?
They would just fall out of the air. Just poof.
They would literally, yeah, so you're in the seance room, you're in darkness, okay, because physical mediumship doesn't work at all when you've got light sources in there. Sometimes you can have a little bit of light, red light, but usually it's in darkness because the energies are destroyed by normal daylight or electric light, yeah? But in the skull experiment, they had kind of luminous strips on stuff, and they also had these little kind of orb-like things they called spirits, which would zip around the room, and that would illuminate things, so you could actually see stuff going on. But the apports would literally, you just hear a thump on the table, and there was an object, which could be a coin, a piece of jewelry, penknife. And in one case, you know, like they had like 50 or 60 different objects appear out of nowhere. And they said that they weren't stolen, you know, they didn't steal them from somebody. They belonged to the deceased or what have you, you know, they were taken. And they would often have special significance for the sitters in the seance, okay? Wow. And in one case, they had a newspaper, right, from 1945, I think, like pristine newspaper that dropped on the seance table. And it was very interesting because it had an article in it on Helen Duncan, who's a very famous English medium who suffered enormously for her mediumship, right? She was such a successful medium that she had a communication with a sailor who had died on a ship. This was during the Second World War, and who'd communicated with her. And this was before the authorities had said that the ship had sunk. So she knew about this before the authorities released the information. And so they were really anxious about that because that was like, you know, what's kind of spying kind of thing, you know. So, you know, it's dangerous to national security. And so she was prosecuted under this ridiculous thing called the Witchcraft Act.
Yes.
Which had gone back centuries. and it's still in activation, you know. And so she was put in prison, and oh my God, she suffered horribly. So she had this. That's right. She told them that she had apported this newspaper into the seance room as a way of saying, "Hey, look, it's me, and you know, this is kind of like what happened to me." And the interesting thing was they had the paper analyzed, right? Because anyone can like mock up a newspaper and print it on modern newspaper. They had the print newspaper actually analyzed by the leading paper specialists in the world, and they showed that it was the paper from 1944 that you could only get that time because they only had they didn't have chemicals that you couldn't get because of the war shortages. So it was a genuine article. It had been made in 1944, and then boom, it comes out of nowhere. Now that is what's called a permanent paranormal object. It's definitive proof of a paranormal event, which in this case is associated with coming from the afterlife.
Oh man! What about the apple? I mean, I guess you could just take a bite of it, no big deal. I mean,
what apple?
Did you say an apple? Also, I thought you said an apple.
Apport.
Oh, okay. Because as I thought, I guess I missed the apple. I didn't see the apple.
Yeah, maybe
I remember seeing like plants.
Apport means it comes from the French apporter, to carry or to transport.
Right.
So it's what that describes what these events are.
Right. Okay. I'm sorry. I thought you said apple. It's that beautiful accent of yours. So I remember like what looked like plants to me. It just looked like plants coming.
Okay.
Down.
Yeah. So this is so I covered the skull experiments, and I also covered a bit about ITC, instrumental transcommunication, which all your viewers will know about, listeners will know about. But this was a particularly interesting thing with this guy called Marcello Bacci, who was a medium and the leading exponent of direct radio voice, which is where a purported spirit voices come through the radio. Okay? So we went down to Grosseto in Italy to film him. And he has a center there where people from all over the world turn up, and usually parents who've tragically lost their children and they want to communicate with their child, right? And so the center is covered with pictures of all these children who have actually come through his radio. And that's just so miraculous. And then, we spoke to some of the mothers who'd spoken to, the voices had come through the radio, and the mothers had recognized their child. And, they just get so much solace, so much relief from that experience. They burst into tears, and it's like, it was really emotional. But what happened, and we had that, we got footage, because when we went to that event with the radio, it was like a 2-hour event. There's lots of people in there, and nothing happened, right? Because he just tunes the radio in between stations and gets static, and then something hopefully comes through. But nothing happened. So I thought, oh, dear, I've come all this way and I haven't got anything. But he said, oh, don't worry about it. We'll go next door and we'll have a seance. So I said, oh, I didn't even know you do seances. So I said, yeah, cool. Can we film it? We've got night shot cameras, so we can film it in the dark. And he said, yeah, nice. Okay. So we put the cameras on. They started the seance, and he said, right, you've got to switch the cameras off. And I secretly kept one running because I wasn't gonna miss it.
Oh, bad boy.
I'm so glad I did, because we captured some amazing stuff coming in. So I was in the seance, so that's the first one I've ever been to, right? And first of all, the table is this very heavy oak table. It's just, you're in the dark, right? But I have my hand on the table, and the table just sort of lifts off the ground as if it, weighs nothing and starts floating in space, yeah? And then I was sitting on the floor, and I felt all these things fall on me. And when the lights came on, the entire seance room was just covered in flowers. It was like somebody transported like a flower shop, the contents of a flower shop, into this room.
Yes, that's what I remember. Yes. Yeah. It's like, holy cow.
I know. It just completely blew me away. Now, obviously, skeptics are going to say, oh, well, somebody just came in the room and threw flowers, right? Because it's in the dark. But you've got to remember that Bacci had been doing this for 40 years. He'd been investigated by a bunch of scientific investigators. He never asked money for his work. He's never accepted donations. And, he got all these amazing results. And the scientists who investigated him have never found any evidence of fraud, ever. So he's the real
And you
deal.
were there too. You were there too. What did you see? I mean, I know you would check it out. So you checked it all out.
I checked it all out. There was a guy, so the voices come through, right?
Right.
And in one case, a young girl had died. It's a teenage girl that died in a car accident, and her father was there. I wasn't there at the time. I just got this recording, and so the father had recorded her voice when it came through the radio, and she recognized his deceased daughter. Okay, they then took a recording of her when she was alive, and they used this FBI endorsed software because a voice is like a fingerprint. Everybody's voice is different, right? Mm-hmm. Biometric identification. They use it to say, for sort of security, right? So they ran it through the software, and the two voices, when compared, were 98%. There was a 98% comparison, which is enough to say it's the same voice. So the deceased voice came through, the living voice, they were identical.
Amazing. The films, it's incredible to watch it. When I just saw all those plants, I just remember all those plants. That's why I thought you had said apple earlier. I'm like, I guess I missed the apple, but of course I would think that could happen since I saw all those like plants and flowers and everything that came down. And the table, you knew that the table was heavy and it was just moving around. It was like it was crazy in so much activity. It was, I've never seen anything like it.
If we talk about, go back to the skull experiment, which is so amazing. They also had levitations and stuff like that. I can tell you a couple of stories about that. So in the States, they did seances in four or five different countries, and they did some in Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. They did this really remarkable thing where, to me, it was one of the most impressive. Well, they had spirit materializations. They had like a hand that would materialize in the seance room and float around and touch people, and so people could actually feel this disembodied hand. Now that's pretty remarkable. That doesn't normally happen in the seance room.
Only in the Addams family do you see anything like that.
Yeah, exactly. So it was a bit like that. Except that people would actually see this hand, but they could also touch it, and it felt warm to the touch, and just like a normal human hand. And yet it's being manifested from the spirit world, which I find remarkable. And then Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, who you probably know all about his work, right? He was there at the seance room, and the spirit said to him, he said, "Hand, can I touch you?" And the woman, it was actually, there was a woman's hand. She said, "Yes, you can." And he reached down. He touched the hand, and he said, "Oh, why can I only touch a hand?" And they said, "Look, it's hard enough getting a hand materialized. You want the whole body. It's really, really hard. But so just be happy with the hand, right?" So then
you always want more. You always want more.
I always want more. Well, they got more. They got the Robin and Sandra Floyd, their mother and Robin's father and mother and sister, who are all deceased, eventually manifested in full physical form in front of them in the seance room.
Oh, my.
And he could converse with them, and he could touch them. I mean, that is as good as it gets in physical mediumship.
Wow.
Mind, right?
Okay, I'm going to throw something at you, okay?
Cool.
So hang in there with me. I'm going to materialize it right at you. Okay. So I know you knew Bud Hopkins, right?
I did. Yeah.
Okay. Did you know Jacobs, David Jacobs? Yeah. Okay.
I did. I interviewed David Jacobs. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Loved him. One of my good friends. Also knew Bud at the very end of his life. But Jacobs would say, and I know that he probably said it because of Bud as well. They were best of friends, right? And did their research. They could even, they could think separate of each other too, but I believe they both agreed on this. They're pretty much right on the same line with each other for sure. But Jacobs had said to me at one point, he said, Dr. David Jacobs, you guys, the alien abductions is what we're discussing here, is he had said, I wouldn't be surprised if all the things that people experience are aliens doing the talking, doing any of the touching, any of the things that people might think is a ghost or might think is this or that or this. So when people experience ghosts in homes, or any type of thing, maybe even like the skull experiments or anything like you've been talking about, he would say it's a good possibility it could be the ET, and they're just, it's okay. They'll just, whatever you want to think it is.
Nah,
What do you think of
believe
that?
For a minute. No,
That was one of their thoughts.
Not.
That was one of their thoughts.
I mean, absolutely not. Absolutely not. But, what? Obviously, you're getting a variety of different things. I mean, the majority of things going on in seances are communication with dead people. Okay. In the skull experiment, they did a sort of kind of video thing where they were actually able to get sort of images sent from the afterlife, if you like, and they got this one image of this kind of what they call blue. And he was like a kind of gray alien. He looked like that, except he was blue, and it was his head. So he came in. They had voices coming in saying,
well, there's an alien right there, dude.
Yeah, okay, sure. I mean, they can come in. They've obviously got interdimensional capacities. So
and it was interesting looking,
that's
too.
no
It was
problem. So you've got aliens come in, but they're not masquerading as spirits. I mean, because you're talking about people
but he's saying that the aliens could masquerade as anything you want just so you'll believe.
Okay. I get
Yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Okay,
And he, right? Because if that makes it easier for you to handle, then that's what makes it easier for you to handle them. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I hadn't heard that one. That's super interesting.
It is, isn't it? Yeah.
Instead of it being an owl or something, this kind of like whatever they want to present to you so you don't get freaked out. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Personally, I would like to see them as they actually are. I mean, I'm totally up for that. You know what I mean? I want to see what these beings actually look like and interact with them.
Yeah, well, then stick with me, baby. I'll show them to you. So you ready? You ready for it?
No, I'm getting worried now.
I know, it's true. I've seen some crazy things out there,
I'd love to talk to you about that more at another time, because you're the expert on that one. It's the abduction I kind of like tip my toe into, and and I knew Bud very well because he was partnered with Leslie Kane, who's my best friend.
That's right.
And we collaborated on a lot of stuff, right? And she was behind the Netflix series. So I would sit down with Bud. I stayed in his apartment in New York, and we would talk for hours and hours about abduction. But he went right down the rabbit hole there with that one, and I didn't go down as far because I'm just still confused about what's really going on with abduction. It's such a complicated phenomenon.
They are. I just think Bud and Jacobs really just nailed it. I think they nailed it.
Yeah. What about Dr. Mack?
Yeah. Well, they liked him, right?
Yeah. I mean, he brought a huge amount of credibility to the whole thing. I interviewed John in London when the Travis Walton film came out in London, Fire in the Sky. And I was interested, so he came over and I was interviewing him. And, that was actually one of the reasons I kind of got super interested in abduction, because I found him so impressive. A man of his intellectual caliber had done the homework,
Yeah, which one are you talking, Travis or John?
Sorry? John Mack.
John Mack. Okay, you're talking John Mack. Okay.
I just love that guy. I love that guy. And,
I never met him.
This film. Oh, he's an amazing guy.
Yeah.
He's a Pulitzer Prize winner. He had a brain the size of, Florida. And, he was just very open-minded, and he was able to sort of get into a subject which, as an academic, you can lose your career over, So he had.
That's what I liked about Bud and Jacobs, the same way, right?
Yeah, I mean, you're out there on the edges, and especially this is going back a bit. I mean, it's much more mainstream now, but back then, I mean, I did a program on abduction for the BBC Radio, which I was amazed they accepted it, and I interviewed some abductees and blah blah blah, and it was a short. It's on the website, but it's sort of it was like when I broadcast it, They didn't tell me that some BBC guy came in afterwards and said, "Oh well, abduction's been scientifically investigated, and we don't think it's true." They didn't tell me that when it went out on the broadcast. I was really pissed about that.
Oh.
But that's par for the course.
Is it white
BBC,
noise?
They have to be German, huh?
What's the name of? Where's the documentary that you're talking about? Or what's the? I'm sorry.
This was a short 5-minute radio program for BBC Radio 4.
And
I did it ages ago. So that's because I had met this abductee. And John, I think John's in that one. And I did I do an interview? Yeah, I did an interview with Travis Walton as well. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I see Travis's face on one. Okay.
These are all the big famous cases.
Yeah, and no doubt. Now, to me, this is me, and it's great talking with Travis. I think he's one of the one-timer people. I think otherwise you're lifers and you're taking a lot all the time, all your life. But I think once in a while, it happens once in a while. Now, and I think that's what happened with Travis. This is my thought. But Jacobs would fight and argue that, and maybe because Bud would say it too. I don't know. I've just spent more time with Jacobs, but he thought, well, I wouldn't be surprised if he hadn't been taken before, sticking with what they had learned and what their research showed them. I also I'd been at Bud's apartment, hanging out and talking with him there. It's just amazing people.
Yeah, absolutely. He's sorely missed. But let me ask you this. I want to ask you a question, basically. So
okay.
we know that ETs have been neutralizing nuclear missiles. We know that the U.S. government,
because of Out of the Blue, taught me that. Okay, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah. So you can see in Out of the Blue that the interview we have with Salas, who was the launch control officer at Malmstrom Air Force Base. Amazing. When the UFO hovered over the base and switched off 22 ICBMs, right? And he's come out more and more since the film. And that's become much more accepted, yeah. But when we did Out of the Blue, it's still a bit on the edge. And that's a fascinating thing. Now, okay, so and he says, of course, that, they did that as a demonstration to show us that don't use nukes, You kids can't play with these kind of toys, right? Too dangerous. You're too primitive, right? So, and other people have gone further. Because in the Rua case, where there was this contact case, in Zimbabwe, when the kids saw this UFO land and the ETs came out and interacted with the kids, and Dr. Mack investigated that, and it's really amazing. And of course, like many abductees, they were told, "Hey, you guys are screwing up the planet. What are you doing? Don't go down this technological route and screw up the planet, right?" So the extrapolation from that is, if they're willing to intervene trying to stop us blowing ourselves up with nukes, do you think they will have a kind of intervention, like alcoholics, you have the family have to take them to a clinic and against their will because they can't save themselves? Do you think they would intervene on a level to stop us destroying the planet in terms of climate change and stuff like that?
Oh, man, I tell you what, we just got a couple minutes here to close out, so I'll tell you really quickly. They can do, this is my theory, okay? You ready for it?
I'm ready.
They're not going to do any intervention with us. If it's important for them to keep the planet fine, then they will just keep the planet good any way they want, whether it's taking us out or just fixing it on their own, or, if that scenario is really going to happen or be the case. They can, what I've seen, what I've learned, they can do anything they want, and they can take us out in a heartbeat, and they can just shut us off. I think they can turn us off and on, and they can just shut us off and do whatever they want us to do. They don't need to intervene. They can make us do what they want us to do. That's what I've learned.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So, good try, but, okay, bring it on. Let's talk. So we've got Tim, it just flew by. You're awesome. You're so fun. I'm glad you had enough energy to hang in there with us for a couple hours. Tell everybody where to find you and what's next. What's next with you?
What's next is I'm just editing together the stuff that I shot because we were going to do a trilogy of films on the afterlife. So we did the Afterlife Investigations. We did Calling Earth, which is about ITC communication, which is on my website for free. And then I'm going to do the finish off that footage, which is just lying in my drives, which is, near-death experience, out-of-body experience, mediumship, and reincarnation. So that's the next one.
Excellent. Wow. Dude, where are you going to fit our work in? When's that going to happen?
What, me and you in the RV looking for Sasquatch, yeah?
Maybe. Maybe actually. Absolutely. Tim Coleman there. Wow. Award-winning documentarian, filmmaker, photographer, journalist, broadcaster, and friend. So you take care, Tim, okay? And hey, you ready to see some stuff? I'm ready to show you.
I want to see it.
Yeah.
I want to see it. I want to see it's more than that picture you sent me. I want to see something else. I want to see something up close and personal, right?
They're going to talk to you. They're going to go, Tim, nice to meet you. It's been a while. What took you so long? That's what's going to happen. So he's just been hanging out in Egypt, taking pictures of Egyptians while he's out there. That's what's going on with Tim. Thanks a lot, Tim. I really appreciate it. You take care. All right. So Tim Coleman joining us. Great guy. I'm going to freak him out one day. I'm telling you, I'm going to freak him out and it'll be fun. And then he'll be like, what took me so long? Oh, mercy. Thank you guys for enjoying that with me too. Let me know if you have enjoyed that.
Welcome back to Coast to Coast. Jorge Martin has been a journalist for more than 30 years. He specializes in UFO and alien phenomena, writing about those from the vantage point of Puerto Rico and the Caribbean. But he also has covered a heck of a lot about U.S. military activity down in that area, written tons of articles. He's lectured all over the world, has written a number of books. He's the editor of a magazine, and he's joining us now to talk about Fidel Castro's interest in these topics. Jorge, great to have you on the show.
Thank you, George. Glad to be on your show tonight.
I am trying to think how long it is that we've known each other. It's got to be early 90s, 1990, 1991. And
91, I believe, yes.
I have the highest regard for you. You've always been an honest guy in terms of as a journalist, as a reporter, and I'm very interested to hear what you have to say about this. Let's start this way. I know a lot of people don't like Fidel Castro for all kinds of reasons, historical reasons, policy reasons, but regardless of what you think about him as a dictator or leader, he strikes me as a guy who has a avid interest. He reads a lot. He knows about the world around him, so I'm sort of not surprised that he might have an interest in these kind of topics. Is that what struck you?
Well, the thing is that I have never heard that about Fidel Castro or the Cuban government to talk openly about the UFO matter before. This was something that I knew just by accident, okay? Talking with some people who knew him from Puerto Rico, who were friends of his, who visited Cuba. Lawyer Juan Maribraz, who was a pro-independence political leader here in Puerto Rico, and a friend of his, Mrs. Providencia Trabal. On one occasion, I was back in the year 2002. I was participating in a book fair here in Puerto Rico, and I was introducing the book I published about the incidents in Vieques. You know, this island in the east of Puerto Rico?
Yes.
Where there was this struggle with the U.S. Navy, with the people of Vieques who wanted the Navy to leave the island, etc. The Navy was using the island as a bombing site, an experimentation site, and for military exercises. But we discovered there that apart from that, the island was being used, okay, secretly by the U.S. Navy in some type of secret alien contact, okay? They were in the area that was used for the bombing practices that was limits to everyone. We were able to speak with people who were there in security, civilian guards, Puerto Ricans who were there also for the U.S. Navy in security, and many others who worked there. And in many occasions, they saw this huge craft coming down, okay, and landing there. The Puerto Rican personnel was taken out from the area, from the site, as well as the low-ranking officers from the Roosevelt Road Naval Station and the Navy. And only high-ranking officers remained there. Whatever they were doing there with whoever was in those ships, we don't know. But we also found that there was a very high activity, alien activity, in the area. All the fishermen all around the island, if you go there, George, you can verify this by yourself. All the fishermen there have had experiences of this craft coming out from the water, going into the water all over the island, around the island. They saw these great type aliens, humanoids, coming up from the sea and going into the lagoons in the island, coming up from the lagoons, and many other situations. The policemen there, the state policemen, the municipal policemen, the government officers of the municipality of the island, everyone there had seen this, but they were afraid to talk about it before I went there because of the struggle they had with the U.S. Navy, and they were afraid that, something could happen, so they prefer not to talk about it. But then they opened up, and all this information came out. I was in this book fair in the year 2002, presenting the book, and while doing that, I met a lawyer, Juan Maribras, and Mrs. Providencia Trabal. He was also presenting a book he had made on his political ideas about the situation of Puerto Rico. And we began talking about the situation of the UFOs. Mr. Maribras had to leave for a moment, and I continued talking on with Mrs. Providencia Trabal, who was very interested in the UFO matter because she had had experiences herself, something I didn't know about. And then all of a sudden she said, hey, you know something? Juan Mari is very interested in this matter of the UFOs. And
Juan Mari is who? Who is that?
Juan Maribras is the lawyer here in Puerto Rico who was a very prominent political leader advocating for independence for Puerto Rico, and also a socialist leader here in the island. And he was a personal friend of Fidel Castro. He visited very frequently the island of Cuba, and Mrs. Trabal was a very close person, very close to Mr. Juan Maribras. And she told me Maribras was very interested in this matter. And I said, really? And she says, yes, because he, on one occasion we began talking, and he just talked about the situation, and he was very interested. And he told us that Fidel Castro had told him something very important. He said, Fidel Castro talked to him about the UFOs and aliens, things like that. And she said, yes. He told us that on one occasion they were talking in Cuba, and Fidel Castro disclosed to him that on one occasion before the fall of the Soviet Union, he had visited Cuba. I believe, George, that it could have been in the 60s, at the beginning of the 60s. And he was taken by the Soviet authorities to this military base, which I believe must be in Astrakhan, in the Shiktur area. And he was shown in a special laboratory that they had there in a building, a place there where they had this craft. He was shown a flying saucer type craft, and allegedly, by what Maribras said, the corpse of his pilot, okay? And he told all it seems to him too. And I said, wow, I never imagined that something like that. And he said, well, he's very serious about this, and I believe him because he's a very serious person. And I know Maribras was a very straightforward person in his ideas, and if he said that, it must have been true. Later on, as he returned, I talked to him, me and my wife, Marlene, and he acknowledged everything, but he wouldn't elaborate more on it because he felt that maybe Castro had told him this in confidence, and he shouldn't be talking about this, but he acknowledged that it was true.
And he told you that you had to keep it quiet until some undetermined...
No, the thing is that I had the information for years, as you can see, since year 2002. Prior to that, George, I had some knowledge about Castro's interest in the possibility of intelligent life, alien life in the universe, because in year 2000, the filmmaker and documentalist from Cuba, Octavio Cortázar, who was very well known, and he had been also president of the UNIAC, the National Union of Cuban Writers and Artists, and also he has been professor of the first filming school and television school in Cuba, and also professor in different countries, in Spain and other places too. And he was very known in Cuba, very respected because of this. And he came to Puerto Rico in the year 2000 to participate in a filming festival here, San Juan Cinema Fest, which was celebrated in San Juan, in Puerto Rico. And when he came, he called us to our office, asking to meet with us because he was very fond of the UFO matter, and he had, as a matter of fact, he had produced a documentary about the UFO incidents in Cuba, and he wanted to meet with us to give us a copy of the documentary. We met in his hotel in San Juan, and we talked about the UFO incidents in Puerto Rico and in Cuba, and and the different type of cases that have happened here, and the similarity with many of the cases happening in Cuba, which I knew nothing about at the moment. It was very interesting to hear everything he had to say, and then to see the documentary, because it was a very good one. Even though it was simply done, it was a very good documentary with a lot of very good information. And then he told me, I don't know why, all of a sudden he said, you know something, I can tell you this, Fidel Castro is very interested in this matter, and in the possibility of alien life in the universe, intelligent life. And I said, why did you say that? And he said, because when the Pope John Paul II visited Cuba in 1998, he met with his ADs first and talked with a couple of them, some priests, and talked about the possibility, what they talked about, the possibility of intelligent life out in the universe, apart from Earth. And they expressed to him that they believe that maybe 99% was very probable that there was life outside the Earth, and possibly intelligent life. And then later on, he said, when he met personally Pope John Paul II, and they discussed the matter, and they talked about everything, and they agreed that there was a very high probability that there was intelligent life in the universe. And allegedly, according to what Cotarza told me, apparently they also talked about the UFO matter in that occasion.
So just to make sure I've got this. So in '98, the Pope visits Cuba, and he has a conversation with Fidel Castro in which they discuss not only the possibility of ET life out there, and they conclude that it's real, but the possibility that UFOs represent something alien.
Well, I don't know if really the UFOs. Cortázar told me that apparently they had discussed that,
and they expressed the opinion that there is life out there in the universe, but you don't know what was said about UFOs.
Well, according to Mr. Cortázar, they discussed the possibility of alien life, life in the universe, and they agreed on the possibility that it was very high, that it was very possible. And according to Cortázar too, apparently they discussed the alien matter and the UFO matter.
It makes you wonder if Castro would have confided to the Pope what he had seen in the late 60s, what you were just telling us about.
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question.
You don't know the answer, though?
I don't know the answer, no.
Back to this thing about Castro being shown this. Where did you say this base was?
Well, apparently that's... you
don't know for sure?
That's a hypothesis of mine.
Okay.
I believe it must have been, there are two places in Russia where there have been a very high activity, alien activity, and where it has been said that the Russian government and the ex-Soviet Union have some sort of Area 51 type facility, where
right.
They have these crafts and they are doing reverse engineering on them, and they have corpses of alien.
Is that Kapustin Yar? Is that one of them? Kapustin Yar, I think it's...
I believe that it must be Kapustin Yar in Shiktor area, in Astrakhan.
So Fidel Castro would have been shown this. Is any indication that the Russians said, look, we'll show it to you, but you have to keep your mouth shut?
I didn't know that. Okay.
Why I'm asking is...
I believe that they must have said that to him, and also that for some reason they decided to keep this confidential. But according to what Mrs. Trabal said, and Mayuraz, he was shown the craft, a flying saucer type craft, and the corpse of an alien that looked very human but very tall in size.
Very tall?
Very tall in size, yes.
You indicated that you also had kept this quiet. You've known about it since 2002, but you had to wait until the conditions were right. Can you tell me what the conditions were? What's changed?
The thing is that when Cortázar told me this about his knowledge, the knowledge he had about the discussion of Castro with the Pope John Paul II, he told me that he preferred for it to be Castro himself who eventually disclosed everything and talk about it. Okay, and I respected that. I gave him my word that I would do that. At that moment. Then afterwards, when I came to the knowledge of the information that was given to me by Mrs. Travala and Mariras, thinking about what my promise to Mr. Cortázar, I preferred to keep it quiet until now because Fidel Castro published recently one of his so-called reflections, in which he writes about different items, geopolitical situation, ecology, etc., etc. As you said, he's very keen. He's very involved with many type of activities.
Yeah, he has wide interests, right?
That's what you said at the beginning of the show, and he's very like that, for all I know. And he published this reflection in which he was talking about the possibility of a war that could happen at any moment, the danger we were involved with at this moment, and also talk about ecological matters, and then he veered into the area of possible life in the universe, And he talked about his meeting with the aides of the Pope back in 1998, and the discussion he had with the Pope himself.
Okay, so he said all this, admitted it.
He opened the door, and I felt that the promise I had given to Mr. Cortázar was well kept, but as Mr. Castro opened the door himself, I felt I could publish all the information I had.
I've always thought, Jorge, I've thought about Cuba as a place that could blow the lid off the UFO mystery because, they must see all kinds of what we would call UFOs, but by that I mean American spy planes and drones and satellites flying over it to keep an eye on to see if any missiles are going in or whatever they're up to. They must see all kinds of things in the sky and have great capabilities for detecting things that intrude their airspace. I would think that Cuba must be sitting on a treasure trove of UFO-type information, and that if they wanted to, they could embarrass the U.S. by putting out what they know. Well,
I know as a fact that for many years they have been involved with the UFO situation, even though they don't talk about it officially. The Cuban Academy of Sciences seldomly say anything about the UFO matter. Okay, most of the investigation and research is made by civilians, but we know as a fact that since the 60s, there have been many, many important UFO incidents that have occurred there in the island, in which military personnel from the Cuban government were involved with, and also that, especially in the 60s, when the Russians were there, and they had this scientific personnel in their bases, etc., in many of these occasions were in which important incidents occurred, the Cuban military forces asked for the help of the Russians, and many investigations were done together, and this got the officers of the Cuban government more involved with the situation. They became more aware of the reality of all of this, and there have been many incidents. You may remember the incident that happened back in the 70s, in which a Cuban MiG jet fighter was destroyed by a huge spherical shaped craft when the pilot announced that they would fire a missile to this object, and all of a sudden the plane broke apart and exploded in the air silently, and the other jet aircraft that was accompanying it reported everything. This was reported in the United States because they heard the communications.
So a Cuban MiG was shot down
in Florida that could hear everything that was happening, and there were many other incidents like those. So they are very aware of the situation.
So a Cuban MiG was shot down by a UFO.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, I don't know. Do you have sources in the Cuban military or within Cuban civilian sources that know about the military, about what else they might have?
Well, I have been contacting people who know about the situation in Cuba, including Cuban UFO researchers. There are many things that have come out from the United States themselves. People in the military who were, how can I say, George, who knew about these incidents that were happening. And there have been books and also the documentary coming out from Cuba now with many reports of incidents that have been happening there. And that's the way I've been getting all this knowledge about the situation there.
You've followed this field for so long. Give me your thoughts about the Vatican. Now, this conversation that you say took place between the Pope and Castro in the late 90s, in the years since then, the Vatican has radically changed its position on UFOs and ET life. Mm-hmm. I mean, they've come way out on this topic, saying that it's real, that there's nothing fundamentally at odds with what the church believes. It's almost as if they're preparing us. I wonder if the information Castro gave them affected the church's position on this stuff.
Not only that, George. As we know, the Vatican is a power. Okay, it's another power from in our planet, a political power, and they have knowledge. They have their own intelligence division. They have all knowledge about what's going on all over the world, and they know about this matter too, about the UFO.
Help me. Let's broaden the topic a little bit to beyond Fidel Castro. One more question about him. I wonder if there are any plans for after he's gone to make any kind of revelation. I would think that if he dies, that the American government extends a hand and we become friends again, that we'll never see whatever's in those files. Well,
I hope that before he dies, he will, say something about this, because bereft what you may think about his ideology, etc. If he does this, if he do this and talks about what he knows, it would help a lot, to get this out to the public and help make some changes in our world that were badly needed,
Could just be that the Russians still don't want him to talk about it.
Well, I don't know. As you know, at this moment, Raul Castro was visiting Russia in a surprise visit in the tour he was doing in Asia, and who knows if they were talking about this too.
Broaden the topic a little bit.
They must be aware that this has come out.
Yeah, they monitor this stuff pretty closely. On another subject from down in your part of the world, chupacabra. I have never given much credence to this. I don't know, I haven't studied it in depth, but I know that that's where the whole story originated. What do you make of that, and what's the chupacabra situation, if there is one, now? Well, right now there's nothing. Nothing is going on, but I can tell you that there was something to it, okay? I checked the situation for many years. Most of the research on the matter was done by myself, and there was something wrong. Something was really going on, There were thousands of livestock that were killing many in very strange ways, and everything implied that what was going on was real, So what's your theory on what happened to whatever was doing that? Say it's a creature of some sort, whether it was some kind of weird psychological experiment or disinformation effort. Where did it go? Why did it go away? Well, I can tell you this, okay, as a summary. It was real. There was a very strange creature involved with the killings, and not only one, apparently several of them. But there was also some type of manipulation, because in some cases, even though flying saucer type crafts were seen in the same places at the same time where these attacks were occurring, and the sightings of this creature were being made by the witnesses, in some cases, George, some of the crafts were being escorted by an apparent secret military personnel dressed in black in 4x4 vehicles, and who, when they were discovered, also always told the witnesses to leave the area because they were doing something with this craft and they didn't want to be bothered with when they were doing whatever they were doing. So
seems to be some type of manipulation of the whole situation.
Well, that isn't the first time that's happened there or anywhere else, that's for sure. Same kind of stuff reported all over the world. Talk to me about the UFO picture on your home, Puerto Rico. The activity you were describing on that island where the Navy has done all that bombing. Do you see the same kind of stuff flying in and out of the water these days as you saw for years?
It continues to happen, okay? And maybe you recall that back in 1996, the NASA shuttle, okay, in mission STS-80, I believe it was, filmed several incidents up in space, okay, in which they recorded these UFOs all over the Earth, in orbit. And there's one film made by the astronauts in which you see something coming up from the Earth, okay, out to space. At first, they said that it was in the area of Sao Paulo, Brazil. But then it was corrected. The information was corrected, and it was identified exactly as the island of Vieques in Puerto Rico. At the sun of the island, this object came out from the sea, flying up to the sky at 500 miles per second. When it got close to the space shuttle, it veered to the left and disappeared in deep space very fast. Okay? You can see that in the recordings that have been made, STS-80 mission, and that was in Vieques. Last year, I was checking with Google Earth that area, checking if I could find something that would let me see that there was something down there. And I went to the area where you can see undersea, okay? And I made some enlargements of the image in Google Earth of that area of Vieques on the southwest of Puerto Rico. When you enlarge the image, you can see that there's something there south of the southwestern tip of Puerto Rico, southeastern tip of Puerto Rico, right between the city of Ponce and the town of Patillas. And there's something very weird down there, very big, with a very geometric shape, okay, that doesn't seem natural. It seems some type of huge artificial structure. And beneath that, a little farther away, there are four apparent structures in rectangular shape that form themselves a quadrangle, okay? That is no way that is natural, okay? It seems to be some type of structure artificially made by some intelligence. And also, a little farther to the north, you can see in the seafloor, okay, you can see something like a tunnel or a road that goes from that place up to the continental shelf of the southern part of the island and connects to the area of the town of Ponce. But the thing is, George, that area depicted where these things are is almost a third part of the island of Puerto Rico. It's something very huge, and I don't think that this was made maybe by the U.S. Navy or something like that.
Well, what about that possibility? You've read a lot of the stuff about a secret space program, the speculation by a lot of American UFO researchers that we've got our own flying saucers, that we've got things that can go into space, that maybe we have a secret space program based somewhere. Could that be it? Well,
I believe also that the U.S. has some type of technology that allows it to do this type of craft. They have maybe some type of a secret fleet. But there's also the real ones, I would say, the real alien type crafts. And, for example, if you go to the rainforest here in Puerto Rico, the Yunque rainforest in the east of the island, there have been for many decades, a very high activity there of UFOs and aliens. Many people have seen them. Forestry service personnel who work there, policemen, tourist visitors in the area, people who live nearby, surrounding all the area. there are mountains that open there, and UFOs come out from these places, flying saucer-type crafts. There's even a phenomenon that I know will be of interest to you, George, because the job that you did with the incidents occurring in Utah. The government ranch.
Yeah, the Skinwalker Ranch, right?
The Skinwalker Ranch, that's correct. There's an area there between the mountains of El Yunque and El Toro in the rainforest that many people have seen that opens. The matter, the surface disappears. A strange haze, a glow, a reddish-orange glow appears. Everything in that area, in that perimeter, disappears, and you can see a very, very big hole in the earth, okay? And down there, it has been described by policemen, by people from the 43 service personnel. They see very far down, deep, underground, like a city, very illuminated, very bright. Okay.
Hey, Jorge Martin, we're out of time. I want to thank you for coming on and sharing this information with us. We put a link on the Coast to Coast site, a link to your blog spot if people want to read more about this, both in English and Spanish, the Castro story, and a lot more. Jorge, I hope you'll keep us posted on whatever you're working on and come back and see us.
Welcome back. I mentioned that the book, The Entity Letters, is one of the very best I've ever read based on one of the longest and most intriguing studies of spirit communication ever undertaken. Now, consider my mind blown all over again. Dr. James McLennan has put together an entertaining and scholarly examination of a wide range of what we might call paranormal or supernatural or religious events and phenomena. And he is no armchair expert. Professor McLennan, a sociologist, has traveled the world to see these things for himself, including some absolutely harrowing experiences in places that most certainly qualify as haunted. The book, Wondrous Events, looks for common denominators and connections, similarities between events as reported by different cultures, even in different centuries. It's just a masterful piece of work. I'm so glad to have James McLennan back here. Great to have you here, James.
Hey, it's good to hear you.
I hope I'm not going to embarrass you, but after diving into this book, Wondrous Events, I gave, I wanted to say, you're something of a badass. I mean, this is not for the timid, the kind of things you did. You didn't just talk the talk. You definitely walked the walk. In particular, these haunted house events that we're going to get into a little bit later.
Well, they're out there, that's for sure.
Wondrous Events, terrific title. It belies some of the really scary stuff that's in the book. How did you settle on that title?
Well, there's a question as to really what's going on, and we don't really know. But there's a kind of a common feature that it stimulates wonderment. People just really, really wonder what's going on. So that's why I chose the concept of wondrous events.
When did it first come out? Because I was looking, I've been watching to see when you'd have something else come out so I could invite you back. And I saw a publication date that said 2021. I thought, aha, here's a new one. But then I saw that an earlier version had been out. So when did you put this out?
Well, this book was published in 1994, Wondrous Events.
Oh, so it seems like it's more up to date. Have you added new material since then?
Well, since then I continued that whole line of research, and my second book is called Wondrous Healing, and that came out in 2002.
I called this courageous not only because you were willing to kind of go into the belly of the beast yourself with some stories that we're going to get into, but also you were obviously aware of how much grief you'd probably take from skeptics, debunkers, other academics, people for whom this is all nonsense, and they know this without ever cracking open the book or reading past the title page. You kind of addressed them early on, talking about how this is a sociological study, so you make no claims about physical causes for the events you describe. I wonder if that worked with some of them.
Well, it turns out it hasn't really worked all that well, but, life goes on, and the same phenomena that happened all those years ago is still going on today. So the world keeps going around no matter what.
Well, I like that attitude. But I mean, we look at some of the events that you describe, and you say it's a sociological study. You make no claims about physical causes for these events. It's unlikely we could do that even if we wanted to. But what is done, I think, is that science is used to cross things off the list. They could say, well, this is not paranormal or supernatural because of X and Y. You do some of that yourself.
kind of showing that you're not totally gullible or infallible, and you accept everything on face value. And the example I would use is the psychic surgeons. There's a chapter in the book about psychic surgeons. You wrote that you watched more than 1,000 of them in person, and you even underwent one yourself. And in the end, you're pretty sure it's all sleight of hand, that it's not really what is presented as real, right?
Well, you could reach that assumption. It's a part of the culture in the Philippines, and particularly north of Manila. But there's kind of a mystical orientation. There's a lot of belief among people in the Philippines. So it's not just psychic surgery, but there's a lot of kind of cultural phenomena going on there.
And when they cut you, when the surgery was done on you, what kind of incision was made? And do you think they used a blade of some kind?
Well, let's just back up a little bit. I was in Asia and traveling around Asia with the University of Maryland Asian program as a college professor. So I was spending my time in visiting indigenous psychic performers or paranormal performers because I was curious. And so in the Philippines, that's what they have. They have psychic surgeons, and it isn't that difficult to locate the famous ones. So I was visiting every famous psychic surgeon that I could find. And then I ended up going in the back country and visiting just local people too, regular spiritualist services. And so, yes, it looks like they're doing a surgery, and the blood comes out, and they're pulling people's organs out of the body, and it's an astonishing performance. But it's the same kind of performance again and again. It looks very, very similar again and again. And back when I was in the United States, I visited James Randi, who was active at that time, and he could do psychic surgeries. It looks like a sleight of hand performance.
In this book, Wondrous Events, seems like you were addressing critics before they even had a chance to issue sort of very predictable kinds of attacks. I think the phrase you used is something like, whether these events really happened, as the witnesses describe, if the witnesses believe it happened, it's relevant for your purposes as a sociological investigation, right?
It's a sociological reality, and you see it in every country. Every country that you visit, you encounter this type of thing. Now, I spent 4 years in Asia, and I gathered notes, page after page of notes. And when I got back to the United States, I was pondering what's the core feature in all this, because there's a great deal of difference between country to country. So they're interested in each other, but psychic surgery, you find that in the Philippines and Okinawa. There's shamanic practitioners, they call them Utahs, and Taiwan, they have their own indigenous practitioners, and Thailand, same thing. So there's, some are Christian, some are Buddhist. In India, you have Hindu performances. So I was wondering, what's the common feature to all this? And when I looked through my notes, it seemed like the individual experience, certain people have a propensity to have these kinds of experiences. Now, I wasn't sure exactly what kind of list that these experiences might fall into, or what kind of categories they might fall into. So then, when I got my first job as a professor in Elizabeth City, North Carolina, I was teaching anthropology, and I would have my students go out and just ask people in the community, if you've had an unusual experience, would you tell us about it? And I'd have them write down what the person said, and we started collecting these cases. And it wasn't too many years before I had over 1,000 cases, and then 2,000 and almost 3,000. And I found there's certain categories of spontaneous experience that people have, and some people have a very high propensity for these kinds of experiences. They have more than one. They have many. And those are the kinds of people who become shamanic practitioners or psychic practitioners. And the kinds of experiences they have fall in certain categories. I found that there's apparitions, paranormal dreams, waking extrasensory perception, psychokinesis, out-of-body experience, near-death experience, sleep paralysis, spiritual healing, then a category I called synchronicity, and then also people see UFOs. And then there's another, I just had a miscellaneous category for everything I couldn't seem to categorize. And I found these kinds of experiences occur all over the world. You have the same kinds of experiences no matter where you are. So I would assume that this has something to do with human physiology. It must be related to probably human consciousness.
The skeptics, you write in the book that some of the people who reviewed it, colleagues who were critical of this, they wanted you to add the word alleged to the events that you're describing, the experiences. Just you call it an alleged experience because it maybe didn't really happen. And, scientists as gatekeepers, they decide what's scientific and what isn't. You make the argument that, something that's considered folklore today can be scientific tomorrow. Rocks falling from the sky, and then we discover meteorites later. Hypnosis really does work. That we, and who knows which of the events you describe in this book could be considered scientific 100 years from now.
Well, and also you can devise hypotheses and do sociological experiments with this kind of data. In other words, if you encounter the same kind of experience in one country and another country and then a third country, then when you go to a fourth country, you can expect that you'll encounter that same kind of experience. Now, the frequency that people will report the experience will vary from country to country, but you find these kinds of experiences wherever you go. There's people who have that type of experience.
You did the international approach, Japan, China, the U.S., and these huge surveys that you did and other colleagues did, and you pull them all together. You're looking for evidence of cultural influence, right, to see whether there are commonalities and similarities that would suggest that whatever is being reported here and elsewhere is not just the result of TVs and movie or some cultural influences of kids growing up in other countries and believing this stuff. Am I correct?
Well, the first hypothesis that I was looking at was this notion that the source of folklore and the source of folk religious belief is a product of culture, because sociologists like to think like that. They like to think that culture is so very important that it determines the way that we think. The way that we think is determined by what we've been told, and that if we have a certain belief, then that belief kind of manifests itself in a visionary experience. So I encountered David Hufford's work, about sleep paralysis, and he had devised this new argument, which we refer to as experiential source theory. That theory is that the experience itself is the source of the folk belief. So people believe in, say, ghosts because they see them. They don't. The counter argument would be that people see ghosts because they believe in them. But when you start talking to people, you find that there's plenty of people who don't believe in ghosts but see them anyway. And there's even cases where more than one person sees an apparition or ghosts, and they see it simultaneously with other experiences. So there's reason why people believe. It isn't just it isn't just the individual culture. And then when you go from culture to culture, there seems to be the same kind of experience, say the seeing of apparitions or what people refer to as ghosts in the English language. The same kind of experience is occurring in all these countries.
The surveys that you did, I mean, you started with a couple of thousand your students collected in the U.S., and then you or colleagues, you have surveys in U.S. and China and Japan. It seems like a large number of people. And you ask them, different kinds of things about PK experiences, hauntings, ghosts, deja vu, things of that sort?
Well, I started off using kind of a standardized question that Greeley had used when he surveyed Americans long, 1970s. We asked him about extrasensory contact with the dead and extrasensory perception, and I think there's a deja vu question that he asked, and then I asked it. I had access to students, so I asked random samples of college students at the University of Maryland, University of North Carolina, Greensboro, Elizabeth City State University.
Can you give us the broad strokes of what you found, the percentage of people who have these kind of experiences and how that compares around the world?
Well, there's a lot of variation from country to country, and I found that people in the United States have a pretty higher probability of having these kinds of experiences than other people in a lot of other places, particularly Europeans. But the most interesting finding happened in the People's Republic of China back in 1986 when I was there. I found a very high rate of Chinese students reported unusual experiences. And that was very surprising because these kids had all been raised as infants during the Cultural Revolution, and religious practices were totally banned during that time period. So it seemed that there was some kind of physiological situation going on, which might explain that. And I think the problems of the Cultural Revolution probably caused childhood crises and difficulties, and that seems to be related to these kinds of experiences. People who have had difficult childhoods have a tendency to have more unusual experiences.
What about Japan? Any results from there that were surprising to you, that were wildly different from here?
And that went in the other direction. Japan is more of a secular society, and they seem to have they reported a lower rate of experiences, similar to the Europeans.
Oh, that was one of the key points that you look at in this book, whether, the assumption would be that people of faith would be more open to having supernatural kind of experiences around the world. What did you find on that particular question?
Well, there wasn't a strong relationship between religiosity and the anomalous experiences. In fact, some scholars think that this type of thinking or belief in this kind of thing is a kind of a replacement for a high level of religiosity. It's kind of like a secularized form of religiosity. But I'm not clear in my own mind exactly what the relationship is. There is the kinds of experiences that people report there is a relationship to religiosity. In other words, people who believe in reincarnation have a higher probability of having reincarnation type experiences, and people, for example, Catholics might have a higher probability of having a near-death experience which involved purgatory or something that fit in with their beliefs, but many experiences don't seem to fit with a person's previous religious belief. There's a kind of innovative quality to this whole thing.
And what about I'm sorry?
Spontaneous quality.
Right. One of the questions you ask, I can't remember where it is in the book, but whether or not science education would decrease the percentage of people who report these kinds of events. But I think one of the findings you had is that people who with a scientific education are not necessarily immune from having them, right?
Yes, I sent a questionnaire out to the elite members of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and we found that there's a lower rate of unusual experience among this group, but a pretty high percentage of them have had anomalous experiences and recognize that this doesn't fit in with the scientific culture, but they have the experiences anyway. And the other unusual finding was that the scientists who are highly educated or knowledgeable about the evidence regarding extrasensory perception, that wasn't leading to belief. The thing that seemed to be the major factor that leads a person to believe is if they've had unusual experience. That leads to belief. If you've seen it, then you know that it's real.
I want to dive into hauntings and poltergeist cases, and you make a distinction that hauntings are more long-term kind of events, series of events, and poltergeists are kind of shorter in the duration. Is that right?
Yes. There's been experts who have gathered a huge number of cases, and they find there's a tendency for these things to fall in those two categories, but there's a great deal of overlap. And in my cases, okay, so then, I do this surveys and academic research, but then, and then I also interacted with the parapsychologists of that day, and they started sending me cases with people who had contacted them and saying, well, no, in that time period, there weren't these ghost chasers like today. So they're saying, well, why don't you just find out what's going on. And so I was contacting people and visiting haunted houses and just seeing what kinds of stories they would tell. And cases which I encountered, there's plenty of hauntings, there's plenty of poltergeists, and there's plenty of cases which seem to fall in between.
Well, and you experienced them. You were there and experienced them. I want to talk about a couple of them. There were 20 cases that you wrote about in this book that you studied from 79 to 92. I don't know if you remember all the details, but let's start with the one in Baltimore. This is 1979. 9 people and the family members. They're seeing all this stuff that's going on and on. They end up staying, all 9 go into one room, which seems to be the center of the activity, and watch to stay awake all night to see if it happens, and it does. So then you come in and you stay in that room too. Can you describe what the family was experiencing and what happened when you got there?
Well, I was on the bed, which was thought to be the most haunted, and there were, one of the daughters was on the other bed, and a son was sleeping on the floor, and another son was on the floor. We were just the younger people in the family. The old folks, they didn't want to stay up all night, so we were waiting, and then in the middle of the night, I saw a bright light on the wall, a red light. And I thought, well, that's the kind of thing which they described as being the haunting, And then there's a real loud rap right beside my head, It sounded like that, very, very loud. And I thought, well, there it is, okay. But I'm a skeptical person, or at least in those days I certainly was. I was a very skeptical person. I thought, well, it's got to do something else besides that. The light could just be coming in from the window, and maybe there's some kind of mouse or something in the wall or something like that. And then one of the sons started calling out. He was having a nightmare, and I thought, well, this is some kind of show or something. We jumped up and we turned on the lights, and it turns out that the blind was completely closed. There wasn't any way that the light could have come in from the outside. So, I still remained a skeptical person at the time. I thought, well, maybe someone had shined the light from inside. Maybe they're trying to fool me. So we all, back to our positions, and I fell asleep. And then later on, about an hour and a half later, I woke up and the bed was shaking. It was like some kind of earthquake was happening. And I looked around the room, and nothing else was vibrating. It was just the bed that I was on. And I thought, well, maybe my heart's beating. My heart was beating pretty rapidly because it was an exciting experience. So I thought, well, I'll take my pulse and see if that coincides with this vibration of the bed. And it wasn't. It was a different frequency. So that finally calmed down, and that was the experience that I had in that house. And that was something that those people were experiencing pretty frequently in those days.
And how were they handling it? How was that family handling it with the before you were there? Had they had more dramatic encounters or experiences with whatever it was?
Many dramatic encounters, seeing mist in the air and seeing apparitions and having sleep paralysis experiences and hearing voices. And it gives you insight into the kinds of things that people have, the experiences that they have. Now, they would have experiences simultaneously, but the voice would manifest for one person slightly different than for another person. So it gave me the impression that it has something to do with the individual consciousness and then also perhaps some kind of collective consciousness, because they had the experiences simultaneously.
Meaning that the people were somehow generating this themselves?
Well, that's a theory, and the people themselves, they were very curious about that. And they took all kinds of precautions, and they invited religious practitioners in, and Catholic priests and Protestant preachers and psychics, trying to figure out what's going on. And there wasn't any consistency to any of the explanations, and it didn't seem to really help out. And so it just seemed that over time they kind of became more and more used to this phenomena, and they just kind of adjusted to it. And I suspect there's people who are listening to this on the radio who are in the similar category. A lot of people are really, really disturbed. It just seems so very, very frightening. And so I would suggest just try to relax. And realize that in general these things aren't that harmful, and the fear seems to make it more difficult than if you're not afraid. And so if you could just kind of help yourself reach a calmer state, you'll be better off.
So just kind of get used to having a roommate that you can't see.
Yeah. Now,
You, in one survey that was conducted, I think it was showed that about 10% of Americans believe they've had a haunting or poltergeist type experience.
yes, and that's a fairly, about 10%, but even a higher percent seem to have had the impression they've been in contact with a deceased person. That's very common. Common experience. The problem the most common type is a paranormal dream.
Would describe that.
Well, people have a dream, and then they find out the most common type of paranormal dream is a dream of some event that occurs in the future. So, a person has a dream, and then suddenly or later on they find that event they're in the dream. It has happened exactly as they dreamed it.
I want to ask you about this Alexandria haunting, because it sounded like from what you wrote, the family there was kind of messed up about this thing. They were really spooked. Can you describe what was going on in the house, what had the family had reported seeing, and then whatever experience you may have had?
Well, they were having a lot of haunting-type phenomena, and they had contacted the Psychical Research Institute, and then they had got in touch with me. So I used to go out there about once a week just to talk with them and find out how things were going. And they were seeing mists in the kitchen, and the fire alarm was going off in the house, and the glass was breaking, and this was going on for week after week. And so we did a kind of experiment and had like a little party and tried to invite the ghosts to come. And I don't think we were really that successful, but that seemed to help out. The phenomena then seemed to decline. They had discovered that a previous woman who had lived in the house had committed suicide. So the thought was that was her spirit was coming back and haunting the place. But and as time passed, they were very comfortable with this. That was in those days. I came to the realization there's a tendency for one person to have more experiences than everyone else, and that person might be considered the core person in the phenomena. And if that person leaves the scene, then the phenomena tends to decline. So that's a hypothesis that this kind of thing originates with an individual. So that could be the case, but it also could be the case that there's some kind of spirit in the house too. There's not really a way of resolving that problem. Now, this particular case, I was up at working up in Wisconsin, and I was contacted. The house, the phenomenon had pretty much disappeared, but then it suddenly flared up again, and the house caught on fire, and two of the people lost their lives. So that led to a National Enquirer headline of the case. It said, "Ghost kills couple."
Yeah, you don't. I guess a guy like you doesn't want to really find yourself in a headline in the National Enquirer.
Yeah, it was a shock, but that was what happened. And I interviewed some of the people who were involved, and it seems probable that somebody accidentally started the fire in the kitchen, and the fire probably had a normal origin. But at the same time, when I look back at my notes, the fire alarms had been going off, and they had been seeing smoke in the kitchen, so that it's as if the phenomena had given them some kind of a warning that this might happen. It was strange to look back at it.
I know at one point you were looking at Hong Kong, hauntings in Hong Kong. How do they compare?
Well, my friend Charles Emmons was living in Hong Kong and gathered all these cases, and he found there seemed to be just a normal. There's unusual features with regard to these types of perceptions. It's kind of like a distorted forms of perceptions, and those Hong Kong haunting cases were very similar to ones we see in America and to the Great Britain cases that they gathered in the 1800s even. So there's a very commonality in paranormal features. So I would argue there's probably some type of physiological basis for this kind of thing, for this kind of experience.
There's another haunting case that you personally investigated involving a military police station. I don't think we have enough time to get into that, but we'll jump into that one when we come back. And then I want to talk about sleep paralysis a little bit. As you describe it in the book, I mean, it's one of the most terrifying phenomena that people ever say they've ever had. They're awake, they're aware, and they can't move. That's pretty spooky, and anybody who's had it knows how spooky it can be and how unsettling it can be.
And welcome back to Coast on a Sunday night. George and Ori with you. Wallace Wagner Jr. received his Bachelor of Science degree from West Virginia University. That was back in 1981. Subsequently did graduate work at Marshall University and the University of Charleston. He gained a very unique understanding of the Bible from at least 40 years of study, mostly self-taught. And he had an interest in UFOs, crafts in the Bible, prophecy, the Great Pyramid of Giza, disclosure, everything we talk about on the program. In 2016, he had his own UFO sighting of the white tic-tac variety that we've talked about on the program. His book is called Crossing the Crevice. It's an amazing book, including the stories about Moses, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and some other incredible stories. Wallace, welcome to the program, first of all.
Well, thank you, George. I'm happy to be here.
And great job on the book, by the way. For someone who is getting into this field, you did a heck of a job, my friend.
Well, thank you very much. I did put forth quite a bit of effort.
You sure did. Tell me a little bit about your background, and then we'll get into your work.
Sure. I was born and raised in a little town in West Virginia called Logan. It's a coal mining town. It's in southern West Virginia. I now live in Bedford, Virginia, with my wife of 24 years.
Oh, good for you.
And I call myself an ecumenical Christian these days.
And explain that to folks who may not be that religious.
Well, I can go to any church I want to. Let's put it that way.
All right. That's fair enough.
A basic Christian. And I have been Southern Baptist and Methodist before, but that was in the past.
How did your interest in UFOs start?
Well, I guess I grew up with a mother that was really interested in them, and we watched all the science fiction movies as I grew up. So I've always been interested. But when I saw my own UFO, it changed everything.
I bet. You and I might be brothers, because my mother's the one who got me into UFOs at a young age, too. They like that. She brought me home a book by Walter Sullivan, who was the New York Times science writer at the time. He wrote a book called We Are Not Alone, and it just fascinated me about the probability that we are not alone. And then a year or two later, Look magazine came out with the story of Barney and Betty Hill, the abduction case out in New Hampshire.
I'm familiar with that.
And I just couldn't get enough of this. And I said, I'm going into broadcasting. I'm going to cover these stories. This is what I want to do. And doggone it, that's what I did. Tell us about the Crossing the Crevice. Tell us about the title.
Well, it's an attempt, let's put it that way, to get a group of people, namely people that take their Bible extremely literally, and move them to a place where they can accept a more open interpretation of what's in the book. And I cover a lot of topics.
You do. You sure do.
Actually, the book was getting too long, so I had to cut it off.
It is, by the way, it is a big book, too.
Yes, it is.
And thank you for the little inscription in there, too. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Now, well, let's talk about your UFO case, because that leads us into the book. What happened to you back in 2016?
Well, at the time, George, I was a mailman. And I had just made a delivery here in Bedford County.
Okay.
And I put a package under a carport, and as I was going back to my Jeep, something told me to stop and look up.
Daytime, too, I guess, right?
That's exactly what I did. I'm standing in this lady's yard, and I'm looking up in the air, and right over my head is this craft. Now, I've been taught by a teacher at Liberty University to call them crafts.
Okay.
Not UFOs. They use the word crafts because it's less threatening. But here is this large, maybe 55 feet long craft, maybe 30 feet wide, right over my head, and it's gleaming white. And it appeared to be solid.
Clearly not an airplane.
Oh, no, not an airplane at all. This looked like a white Tic Tac mint. There were no wings, no nacelles, no exhaust, no windows or ports. It was solid.
Was it floating, flying? What was it doing?
It was stationary.
All right.
I saw it for about 2.5, maybe 3 seconds.
And did you keep peering at it while it's saying, oh, this must be a huge balloon or something like that?
Oh, well, let me tell you, everything you can imagine went through my mind after I got home. I thought maybe it was a blimp, maybe it was Google taking pictures. All kinds of things went through my mind. I actually thought, did they want me to see it? Maybe it was a malfunction.
How did it disappear? I'm always curious how they take off.
You know, George, I don't know whether it disappeared or cloaked or took off so fast that I simply didn't see it.
It just was gone like in a blink of an eye.
For me to know what I saw, and then it was gone. It either cloaked or it took off so fast that it was in between the blink of an eye.
Now, when you got home, Wallace, did you turn on your local television news? Did they have any reports of UFO sightings going on that day or anything like that?
No, sir.
Nothing?
Nothing.
Did you report it?
No.
How come?
I, of course, talked to my wife about it, and I mentioned it to my Sunday school class and just some family members, and let it boil for a while.
Included in your book, Crossing the Crevice, is your experience, of course, because you have been to Egypt and Israel. You've looked at the pyramids of Giza. Tell me your thoughts about that.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'm one of those believers that the pyramid is a lot older than we've been taught.
Oh, yeah, I agree with that.
I did get inside, and I had a little square with me. They confiscated my camera, but...
Oh, they did? No pictures, really?
No pictures for me, not that day.
Jeez.
But I did get in with a square, and let me tell you, it is exact. The sarcophagus is exact. And on the back side of the sarcophagus are several holes, and I could stick my finger in one of those holes, and there's about a 3/8 of an inch lip, which tells me that was an awfully powerful drill to have been copper drilling into granite.
And when you look at it, don't you wonder how in the heck did this thing get built?
Oh, of course, it's astounding, and that's an understatement. It just blows your mind away. And to think it was covered in white limestone that was so perfectly placed that you couldn't even see the door to get in.
Any thoughts on how they built it, in your opinion?
Well, if you go back 20 or 30,000 years, I'm going to say it would be the sky gods that built it.
You might be right. I know Zahi Hawass, who used to head up Egypt's antiquities before he got overthrown when Mubarak got dumped.
Right.
He still hangs around out there. But, gosh, you talk to him about the possibility of E.T. involvement in the pyramids, he goes crazy because he wants the Egyptians to be known that they built it.
That's exactly what happens. I was over there for a week, and you talk to the guides and everybody there, and they lead you to believe that, we started out with a pile of rocks, and then we ease into the step pyramid, and then we ease into the bent pyramid, and every pharaoh wants to outdo the previous one. Then we ended up with Khufu. Well, guess what happens some 70 years after Khufu? We're back to a pile of rocks again.
Exactly. I think these guides have been told, Wallace, you do not deter from any other story other than we made these pyramids, or we're going to get you. I think
You're
they put
exactly right.
Yeah, they put the spirit of God in them, to be sure.
I kind of follow Dr. Robert
Shock, yeah.
as well. Yes, sir. And he did some studies with the erosion and whatnot, and he kind of feels they're at least 10,000 years old.
Well,
Same thing with the Sphinx.
There's a lot there, much more than that, which does make you wonder when you tie it into your book, Crossing the Crevice, all the very strange things that may be going on. You have looked at the Bible, and because you're multi-denominational, and you've looked at all kinds of religions, what do you think of the Bible? And then we'll get into the Bible's perspective of the craft, so to speak.
I'm looking forward to that.
It's in my opinion, the biblical is a historical book, to be sure, but you have to interpret it. What do you think?
Well, it is a book of books, and a lot of people look at it as just being one book, so therefore everything in it is correct.
Right.
And to steal a term from Reverend Michael Carter, the gatekeepers of Christianity, kind of sort of have an agenda, and everybody follows that agenda. Well, I'm kind of breaking the mold. I'm not following that agenda. There's absolutely no way that book is inerrant. There's quite a few problems, and if we have time, we'll certainly discuss those.
Yeah, we got about a minute or two before the break. Go ahead.
If you know where to look, it's full of errors, and I'm not going to become a Bible basher here on the air, but
no, I know it.
There's a place in Matthew that refers to Jeremiah, when in fact it's not Jeremiah at all. It's actually Zechariah.
And isn't it conceivable?
That's in every translation.
Isn't it conceivable when they talk about fallen angels, the Nephilim, and all these other aspects, that they're talking about extraterrestrials who came down to this planet?
Well, that's what I believe, and I believe it is scattered throughout the Bible, and I believe it's mostly often overlooked. It's not what the teachers want to teach, and it's certainly not part of the agenda to keep everybody together. And
I think they're afraid to teach that.
Well, that might very well be, but it's still in there. So, if they want people to read their Bible, and if you read it, you're going to come across it, and now you're going to wonder, well, why didn't they ever mention it?
Exactly.
Well, I tell you what, if you're going to talk about the Nephilim, that's going to take a whole show.
We'll have to have you back again.
Well, I'd be glad to come back. If you want answers on the Nephilim and giants, I don't believe you're going to find it in any of the translations. In my book, I stick with the King James, the NIV, the New American Standard, and then the Living Bible, which is one of the loose translations that's kind of popular today. And they're all over the board. I mean, some translations, like the King James, don't even mention Nephilim. And you're left believing that it's either the sons of God that came down and impregnated the beautiful women, and then their offspring were giants, or something completely different, like the Nephilim were there before and then there afterwards, which they're basically given a pass for the flood, which in itself is a contradiction, because in Genesis chapter 7, we're told that everything was killed. And we have no more mention of these people from space coming down again, with just the 8 people left alive in the world. So you're left to come up with your own conclusion.
And do you think the interpretation of the Bible is subjected to a lot of different people?
Yes. I believe that the interpretation basically is to keep everybody in line. There's an agenda, and we'll follow the agenda. You know, whether you have someone that uses a lectionary or something like that, it's all watered down to keep everybody together and in tune. They don't deviate too far from the given agenda.
Let's talk about some biblical UFO type stories and encounters. What do we have out there, Wallace?
Well, I tell you what, George, the Bible's full of them. It helps to establish a little bit of groundwork initially. And that's with 3 words: stars, spirits, and glory. The latter of which most expositors would say is the hardest word to decipher. It has the most meanings. We run into a little bit of a problem that the Hebrew language only had about 7,000 words in it. And you compare that with what we have in our English language today, which is somewhere north of 170,000 words, and you come to realize that those 3 words have multiple meanings. The Hebrew word for stars is ekter. The Hebrew word for spirits is rosh, and for glory, it's kabod. And if you take those 3 words and have an open mind, the Bible's going to open up for you. Let's start with some Old Testament encounters. We talked about perhaps a cloaked tic-tac, is what I saw. Well, there's an event where there were cloaked crafts in the Bible. We found that in 2 Kings, and it's with Elisha, not Elijah, but Elisha. And this story has Elisha's servant not seeing horses and chariots of fire in the air until Elisha prayed to God to open his eyes. And then what the servant saw, now get this, were horses and chariots of fire coming down to encircle Elisha.
Yep.
In other words, they were there all along. And normal people like you and me could not see them, but they beckoned to Elisha's call. And I'm hoping that we can agree that chariots of fire, that's pretty much a give-me.
That sounds like a craft.
You got it.
That sounds like it.
And here's a real good example. It's found in Judges 5. It's a song of Deborah, or your Bible may say the song of Deborah and Barak. It goes kind of like this. The mountains quaked at the presence of the Lord, and the stars fought in heaven. And we know that stars don't fight. From their courses they fought against Sisera. Curse Meroz, said the angel of the Lord, because they did not come and help the Lord. Well, let's just stop right there. Most people today, Bible experts, if you will, say that Meroz was a city in and around the Galilee area. And this is a place where the teachers and writers kind of scratch their head and try to make these verses non-threatening to go along with the agenda. Now, if Meroz, and that's spelled M-E-R-O-Z, was a city, how could they fly up to heaven to help the Lord? They didn't have spaceships. And why does the Lord need help anyway?
And by the way, everything we're talking about tonight, as the Catholic Church would say, does not negate one's belief in God.
That is correct.
That's important for everybody to understand that.
That is correct. This whole passage only makes sense if you realize the Lord is not omni-everything. And that's another topic we could have a whole show on. He flies in a craft. That's mentioned in Psalms as well. And these crafts appear as stars at night. So the only way this passage makes sense, George, is if Meroz is a planet. And inhabitants of the planet Meroz must have been an advanced race, and they did not go to heaven to help the Lord. And what's more is the Jewish Talmud indicates Meroz is a planet.
And if you were a human witnessing things from space, you would put biblical context into it because that's all you understood.
Exactly. And there's so many more.
Did you look at Ezekiel's wheel?
Oh yes,
That's another great case.
That one's a pretty common one, and
what about
proven? Go ahead.
What about Fatima? When the sun came down, I think it could have been a UFO that came down.
Well, I agree. I've been to Fatima, and I do agree that that was a UFO or a craft. Let's talk about Zechariah.
All right.
He saw a flying scroll. Scrolls don't fly, as we know. It was about 30 feet by 15 feet, kind of a cigar-shaped craft.
And we have had cigar-shaped UFOs.
You got it. But this event has more meaning. It's kind of in chapter 6. He looks up again, and he sees two mountains made of bronze. Now, mountains are not made of bronze, and these are up in the air. But now he sees chariots coming out of them. And here's something that's really interesting. We are actually told that those chariots are spirits. And that's a point I want to get across, that spirits or spirit can also mean a craft, just like stars. So that's one place we're told that the chariots are actually spirits.
That's fascinating. I mean, when you look at the possibilities, it's right out there, right under your nose, isn't it?
Oh yes, you have to do your own study to find it, because you're not going to be taught that. Could you imagine being told that from behind the pulpit?
Well, that's not going to happen. Not like that. Do you know Dr. Barry Downing? Or have you heard of him?
I have both of his books.
Yeah, he's another one who believes in the biblical tie-in and correlation with extraterrestrials and UFOs.
That is correct. I wish I would have read his book back in the 60s, and I didn't. I got latched on to Chariots of the Gods by Von Daniken, and I could not put that book down until I completely finished it.
You devoted about a chapter to the 6,000-year-old theory of planet Earth. Tell me about that.
Well, there's absolutely, positively, in my humble opinion, no way the Earth is 6,000 years old.
Hear, hear.
I've got a lot of friends around here that believe that, because that's what they're taught and that's what the Bible says. But I get into a lot of things in my book, such as coal and salt and the Palermo stone, the Turin papyrus, and just so many things. You study all this stuff from all these different sources, and they all point to the Earth being much older than 6,000 years. And I fully believe that. And I'm also a believer in carbon-14 dating. I know it has its proponents and naysayers, but basically it does work up to about 50,000 years. And, we only need to go back 8,000 or 12,000 years to know that it's longer than 6,000. And I put a lot of examples of that in the book.
Well, yeah, there's no question. It's 4.5 billion years old. I believe in science when it comes to this, to be sure. Of course,
and I do as well.
With the Bible, do you think these stories that were put in there were eyewitness accounts? What do you think they were, Wallace?
I believe that they were eyewitness accounts. They just did not know what they were seeing, and they had limited vocabulary, and they just did the best they could do.
Yeah, I think so too. Something very dramatic happened on this planet a couple thousand years ago during the beginning of religion and Christianity and everything else. Something just truly magnificent happened. You think it was specific, that they did it for a reason, the visitations?
It could very well be. I believe that we've had help all along, and I believe that we've never been alone, and we're not alone right now.
So I love the quote from the movie Contact, where the extraterrestrial was talking to Jodie Foster, Ellie, and in essence telling her they're looking for what we're looking for, and that is who created us, how were we created, what are we doing here? They're all looking for the same thing.
That could very well be. That could very well be. I'll throw this out that I mentioned the Talmud. The Talmud mentions, the Jewish Talmud mentions that God flies around at night because he has 18,000 planets to observe. I think about that.
Yep, that is awesome, to be sure. You have got a quote in your book from the late Ben Rich, the former head of the Lockheed Skunk Works. I'm going to read a little bit of that quote and get your reaction to it, Wallace. And Ben said years ago, "We already have the means to travel among the stars, but these technologies are locked up in black projects, and it would take an act of God to ever get them out to benefit humanity. Anything you can imagine we already know and already do." What do you think of those comments?
I love Ben Rich. I have his book from the Lockheed Skunk Works, and I believe it's truthful. He also made another comment that goes right in hand with that, and it goes something like this. There was an error in the equation, and we know how to travel to the stars. And this was back in 1993, George.
Jeez.
And here we are close to 30 years after that. And you go back to the original Star Trek, that came on in 1966.
Yep.
You had handheld communicators, fax machines,
warp speed,
CDs, warp speed, cassette tapes, talking computers, and here we are today. So can you imagine 30 years from now?
All we need is beam me up, Scotty, and we got it all.
Well, we're working on that now. And as I understand it, we are able to transport very small particles, but we've got still a long way to go with that.
You remember the cartoon, The Jetsons, a long time ago when we were kids?
I do. That was one of my favorites, and I believe that's where we're heading.
Flat screens on walls.
You got it.
Were televisions, and we looked at that going, that's crazy. That's too thin to be put on a wall to be a television. And look at, and even Dick Tracy, the talking watch and stuff like that. It's all here.
It's all here. And I'll tell you something else. Ben Rich also said, whatever you can think of, we've already done. And that's, I don't know how you can go beyond that.
We're going to take calls with Wallace Wagner next hour here as we're talking about his work, Crossing the Crevice. You're aware of Stephen Greer, obviously. He's been on our show many times.
He's one of the two people I follow pretty closely.
And what do you think about disclosure? When do you think it's going to happen?
Well, I think you and I are old enough that I don't think formal disclosure will happen in our lifetime.
I've always said that.
We might get bits and pieces. Now, if there's a worldwide upheaval,
or some whistleblower,
that may change things. I'm one of those people that kind of sort of believe in the back of my mind that even if we have disclosure, it may be a false flag event.
To trick us?
You got it. Honestly believe that.
One would have thought years ago, they'll never do that to us. But now that you look at things that are happening on this planet, I think they'd take advantage of us any way they could.
Well, I'm not sure it would be taking advantage. It would really just be an effort to pull the world back to some kind of semblance or to order.
Where do people get your book, Crossing the Crevice?
It's available on Amazon in Kindle, grayscale, or color.
Super.
All three.
It's great. And you've got some great pictures there that you've sent us that Lex has posted at coasttocoastam.com as well. Well done there.
Thank you.
The Coast mobile app is now available for download on iPhones and Android devices. You can become an insider directly through this app. This is a great option for our international listeners, and new users will also receive a free 2-week trial.